The most bitter thing isn't being beaten, but the moment your own husband hands you over to death. Stop this security camera footage right now. Look at this. Caleb calmly watches as the bodyguards drag his pregnant wife into a black SUV, then turns his back and goes inside. Orders takeout and sleep soundly of the ultimate misery, but fate played a cruel trick. Caleb was convinced he had gotten rid of the burden, unaware that Elena not only survived and escaped, but she was also the only weakness of mob boss Raphael Moretti. Both men gambled their lives on one woman, but tonight the traitor will face hell.
Within Chicago's criminal ecosystem, a cascade of violent retribution was imminent. The near-fatal state of a pregnant subject would serve as the catalyst, compelling the city's apex predator to incinerate his own empire for her. This is the case file of Elena Voss, an asset whose function evolved into that of a high-value principal. It commenced at Chicago Memorial, where the sterile emergency room lights flickered in concert with a gale assaulting the windows from Lake Michigan. A rational individual would have sought shelter on such a night. Instead, Elena Voss was exsanguinating in a stranger's taxi. At 2347, she collapsed through the automated doors, supported by a driver exhibiting signs of acute stress disorder. Her high-end coat was compromised, revealing a blue dress saturated with crimson from the waist down. Each point of contact with the linoleum floor left a hemorrhagic print. "Assistance," the driver vocalized, his voice strained. "Required." Two nurses mobilized from their station. The junior staff member, Jessica, observed the scene and experienced a vasovagal response. "Acquire a gurney," Jessica instructed a nearby orderly already advancing. "Immediately." At this juncture, Elena's motor functions failed. The driver barely arrested her fall, his own frame trembling. She repeated, "Drive the infant." Jessica was upon them, palpating for a pulse, a weak, thready rhythm. "Gestation period?" she queried. 7 months. The response was a faint utterance from Elena, her accent thick with exhaustion. "My offspring. Save them." As they mobilized the gurney, Jessica probed further. "Etiology? Vehicular accident? An assault?" Elena's gaze was fixed on the ceiling, unresponsive to external stimuli. Her mouth articulated syllables devoid of sound. "Maintain consciousness," Jessica urged, gripping her hand. "Your name?" A whisper emerged. Elena Voss." "Acknowledged, Elena. Who is your emergency contact? A spouse? Kin?" For a brief interval, a spark of lucidity returned to Elena's eyes. Her hand seized Jessica's wrist with remarkable force, and the name she uttered resonated with clinical finality. Raphael Moretti. The name registered as a significant psychological stressor. Jessica ceased all movement. The orderly halted. The cabbie froze. In the city's collective psyche, that name was a powerful archetype. "Are you certain?" Jessica asked, her professional detachment fractured. "He is the individual you wish for us to contact?" Elena's gaze met hers, suddenly exhibiting profound clarity. "Inform him my evasion attempt failed. Inform him." "They located me." Subsequently, her consciousness receded once more. They breached the doors of a trauma bay. Dr. Marcus Webb, ER director, assessed the situation and began issuing directives. 2 large-bore intravenous lines, a trauma panel, obtain an ultrasound, stat. The room became an exercise in controlled chaos. Jessica withdrew, removing her gloves as her supervisor, Carol, gestured her into the corridor. Did she truly verbalize that name? "Affirmative," Jessica confirmed, her voice faint. "Do you want me to initiate that communication?" Carol observed Elena's pallid form through the glass. "It's protocol. He's listed as her emergency contact. But his reputation is known. And I'm aware of the consequences when Raphael Moretti's directives are ignored." Carol retrieved her phone, her hand displaying a tremor. After 3 decades in Chicago emergency medicine, she had the necessary channels. After several redirects, a voice with the tonal quality of cold metal responded. Identify yourself. This is Carol Martinez, Chicago Memorial. I'm calling regarding Elena Voss. She is... Is she viable? The question severed her report. Carol suppressed a physiological response. Marginally. Her condition is critical. She named your principal. A profound, threatening silence occupied the line. Then, ensure she remains that way. We are en route. The connection terminated. Carol lowered her device, meeting Jessica's alarmed expression. What was the response? They are inbound. Carol noted the time on the wall clock. Notify security, but be discreet, and inform Dr. Webb that his shift is about to become exponentially more complicated. Raphael Moretti was finalizing a transaction when his phone vibrated. He was situated in a corporate boardroom, the legitimate veneer for his expansive criminal organization. 8 influential men sat at the table. None would presume to interrupt him. Yet Vincent Duca, his chief subordinate for 15 years, witnessed the subject's iron self-control fracture upon viewing the screen. He observed the complete loss of color from the face of a man who never showed weakness. Raphael rose. The room became silent. This meeting is concluded. His tone was flat, yet it induced a palpable sense of dread. Vincent, with me. The rest of you, your agendas are now secondary. He departed before they could react. Vincent hurried to match his pace down the hall. What's the situation? Elena. The single word conveyed a universe of meaning. Vincent's jaw tightened. He recalled her from 2 years prior. Elena Koslov, a contract translator who had somehow breached Raphael's psychological defenses. Her location? Chicago Memorial. Condition is critical. Raphael's finger was pressed against the elevator call button, but Vincent could sense the repressed violence radiating from his person. Activate Marcus and Tony, the entire unit. I want a complete lockdown of that facility in 20 minutes. Raphael, Vincent began gently as the elevator doors opened. Her presence there implies... I am fully aware of the implications. The polished metal doors closed, reflecting Raphael's countenance. 6'2", dark hair showing traces of silver, a handsome, impenetrable mask. He had constructed an empire upon that very inscrutability. But in this moment, his hands were shaking. He pressed them against his thighs to cease the tremors. Duration. Vincent understood the query. 17 hours. 17 hours had passed since Elena left their residence for a lunch appointment, offering that private smile he cherished, the one that appeared when she believed he wasn't observing. 17 hours since their final kiss, his palm resting on the swell of her abdomen where their progeny developed. He delivered her to them, Raphael whispered, his voice showing a fissure. Voss took her. He surrendered her to Kozlov's network. That is not a confirmed fact. Yes, it is. The elevator chimed, opening to the secure garage. His black Mercedes was idling. Marcus and Tony were present, 2 more components in the apparatus that ensured Raphael's survival. He took the driver's seat. Vincent occupied the passenger side, his thumbs already manipulating his phone. ETA is 12 minutes, assuming total disregard for traffic laws. Raphael launched the vehicle from the garage, accelerating to 60. The sedan transformed into a projectile, moving through the city's arteries, controlled by a man for whom laws were mere suggestions. A support vehicle with his elite personnel followed in their wake. "Notify them," Raphael commanded, his voice now an instrument of intimidation. "Secure her floor, my personnel exclusively. No unauthorized access, no inquiries. The hospital administration will resist. They will comply." While Vincent relayed orders, Raphael drove, his mind a cold, lethal processor, the same cognitive function that built his wealth and preserved his life. Elena was meticulous. They had both been exceedingly cautious. Her marriage to Caleb Voss was a strategic deception, a protective layer to misdirect their adversaries. But Caleb was financially over-leveraged, consumed by avarice. Desperate individuals engage in desperate bargains. At times, they trade the one asset they pledged to safeguard. Ahead, the hospital emerged from the storm. Raphael brought the car to an abrupt halt in the ambulance bay, ignoring the prominent warning signs. He was out and through the doors before Vincent had disengaged his seatbelt. The emergency room presented its typical Friday night chaos. Distressed infants, intoxicated individuals, the persistent alerts of medical machinery. Amidst this, a fatigued clerk looked up from her monitor to see Raphael's imposing figure before her. "Elena Voss, her location?" The clerk flinched. Her eyes widened. It was a standard reaction. "Are you next of kin, sir?" "I am the party you contacted." "I apologize. I will require identification." Raphael leaned forward, bracing his hands on the counter. His voice lowered to a growl, far more menacing than a shout. 20 minutes ago, someone at this facility was instructed to prevent her death. I am here. Now where is she?" The woman's composure disintegrated. Her trembling fingers navigated the keyboard. Trauma 3. But Raphael was already in motion, operating on instinct. He simply followed the escalating pitch of voices and the frantic rhythm of the cardiac monitors. He saw her through the glass panel, a small form on a large gurney, encircled by the unnervingly efficient calm of the medical team. Elena. Her skin was waxy, a faint condensation forming on her oxygen mask with each shallow respiration. Intravenous lines punctured both arms. The monitor above her displayed data that, even to an untrained eye, resembled a countdown to termination. A physician looked up, made eye contact, and his expression hardened. He spoke to a nurse, then exited the room. "Mr. Moretti," he said, a statement, not a question. "I am Dr. Webb. I am her doctor." The man paused, uncertain of their specific relationship. "What is her status?" Webb's professional facade briefly failed, revealing profound exhaustion. Frankly, her survival to this point is statistically improbable. The volume of blood lost was catastrophic. He enumerated her injuries from the assault, all consistent with blunt force trauma. "The fetus is also in distress." Each word registered as a physical impact. Raphael's hands contracted into fists. "Can you preserve them both?" "We are employing all available measures, but I must ascertain the cause. Was this an accident, or was she targeted?" "If she is hemorrhaging, doctor, then perform your function. I will perform mine." Webb's jaw set, but he gave a curt nod. "We are prepping her for an emergency cesarean section now. The infant is exhibiting fetal distress. Our window is closing." "What is the projected time frame?" "We are proceeding to immediate surgical intervention." As if summoned, the doors swung open. A medical team enveloped Elena's gurney, a choreographed display of urgent precision. Raphael's focus narrowed to her face. eyelids closed, skin pallid and waxen, an arm dangling inertly. He reached, his fingers brushing against hers, which felt as cold as marble. "Elena," he murmured, his voice fracturing. "I am here. Do you register my presence? I am right here." The only response was the stark silence of the hallway. They vanished behind doors designated for staff. Just before they sealed, he registered it. A faint, almost imperceptible pressure. Then she was gone. Raphael remained, the phantom sensation of her touch imprinted on his palm. Vincent materialized beside him, a wraith in the aseptic corridor. "Security has established a full lockdown of this level. My operatives control all egress points." Raphael was motionless, his gaze fixed on the dark crimson stain on his hand. "I require a complete situational analysis," he stated, the words a near whisper, a vocal tone preceding organized violence. "Every detail. I want all surveillance footage. I want subject identification. I want to know who made visual contact with her before she entered that vehicle." "It is underway. Dominic is accessing all video archives. My teams are canvassing the downtown sector. Any witnesses will be located." Raphael finally met his gaze. "Clov's operatives are not known for their subtlety." Their intent was to send a signal to you and to Voss, but they miscalculated. A smile, as thin and sharp as a scalpel, formed on Raphael's lips. He gambled on my ignorance, or that I would classify Elena as acceptable collateral. Vincent, having witnessed his employer's rage responses previously, knew the protocol. "What are your directives?" "What I should have initiated 6 months prior." Raphael's phone was already in hand, his thumb navigating to a heavily encrypted contact. "Caleb Voss will be neutralized by morning, but first I need the identity of the man who sanctioned this operation." The phone cycled 3 times before a coarse voice responded. "Moretti, I did not anticipate further contact. I require intelligence S, the premium grade. Be specific." "Dmitry Klov's command structure. Who is his second in command in Chicago? Who possesses the authority to authorize an attack on a non-combatant?" A weighted silence occupied the connection. "You are aware this action will trigger open conflict, are you not?" "No, this is the termination of a conflict." Raphael's voice was arctic. "Can you acquire the identities or not?" "Allow me 2 hours. You have 1. He severed the connection. Down the hall, a nurse glanced out, registered his presence, and quickly retreated. "Excellent. Let them be afraid," Vincent cleared his throat. "A direct assault on Clov violates the terms of the treaty." "That treaty was rendered void the moment they put a hand on her." "And Voss?" Raphael's expression was unreadable. "I want a complete dossier. Financial records, call logs, surveillance data. If the subject took a breath in the wrong direction, I require documentation of it." Vincent gave a single nod and moved away, his phone already at his ear. Raphael remained stationary, his focus attempting to breach the operating room doors, desperate for intelligence that would not shatter him. Time seemed to warp and elongate. He began to pace, oblivious to the fearful looks from hospital personnel. 20 minutes stretched into 30, then 40, then an hour that felt like a geological age. At last, the doors opened. Dr. Webb appeared, his surgical attire stained a shade of red that stopped Raphael's circulation. "The infant," he forced the words out. A flicker of empathy crossed the doctor's face. "She is viable. Premature, but respiration is unassisted. She is in the NICU." Relief struck Raphael with such force he braced against the wall for support. And Elena? Her condition is critical, but she is currently stable. The next 24 hours are paramount. Webb stripped off his soiled gloves. Mr. Moretti, the perpetrator's intent was lethal. She has sustained multiple fractures, internal hemorrhaging. This was a brutal, prolonged assault. This was motivated by personal animus. I am aware. Had her arrival been delayed any further. But it was not. Raphael's voice was like forged steel. Because she is resilient. When may I see her? She is in the recovery ward, perhaps an hour, maybe 2. Webb hesitated. The authorities will require her testimony. The authorities will wait. I am legally obligated to file a report. Then file your report. Fulfill your duties. Raphael locked his gaze. But Elena communicates with no one until I authorize it. Is that understood? Webb appeared ready to object, but then reevaluated. Recovery room 4. I will send a nurse for you. With that, he departed. For a brief moment, Raphael allowed himself to sag against the wall, the immense pressure of the last 2 hours descending upon him. His daughter was viable. Elena was viable. Those were the only variables that mattered. The remainder would be resolved with extreme prejudice. Vincent reappeared, his face a mask of cold fury. I have acquired data. You will find this information unsettling. Display it. In a small requisitioned office, Vincent opened a laptop. A low-resolution, monochrome image of a street materialized. The timestamp indicated 3:47 p.m., 8 hours prior. A black SUV was positioned at the curb. 2 large males exited, men with the builds of laborers and the crude haircuts of enforcers. They approached a well-kept apartment building, and one initiated a phone call. After 30 seconds, the main entrance opened. Caleb Voss emerged. Raphael became completely motionless. On the recording, Caleb conferred with the men who gestured toward the SUV. Caleb checked his watch and gave a slight nod. One of the men entered the building. He reappeared, forcibly escorting Elena, who resisted him at every point. Even with the poor video quality, Raphael could discern her desperate struggle. Caleb spoke to her, his words inaudible, but his mouth forming them with a disturbing placidity. Then he turned his back on her and re-entered the building. The men forced Elena into the SUV and departed at high speed. Caleb remained for a moment, consulting his phone as if awaiting confirmation, before he also vanished inside. Raphael stared at the static image of the man who had pledged to protect her, now nonchalantly consigning her to death. There is additional data, Vincent said, opening another file. Financial statements. Voss had been liquidating assets for months, submerged in gambling debts owed to a high-risk syndicate. Glove's organization? Affirmative. And 3 days ago, a significant deposit was made to his account. It erased his entire liability. Vincent's voice was rigid with contained rage. He sold her, Raphael. He used his pregnant wife as currency to settle a gambling ledger. The laptop's screen fractured under Raphael's hand. He had not consciously registered applying pressure, the polymer groaning before it splintered. He slowly retracted his hand, flexing fingers that instinctively sought Caleb Voss's throat. What is his current location? His downtown condominium. Arrived at approximately 6 p.m., ordered food, viewed a film, was in bed by 10:30. Vincent's contempt was palpable. He believes he has evaded all consequences. Raphael rose to his feet. Summon Marcus and Tony, I want Voss brought to this location. No witnesses, no errors, no complications. What is your intention for him? Nothing. Raphael's smile was a shard of ice. Not immediately. First, I will see Elena and my daughter. I will sit with them, observe their respiration, and reinforce the fact of their survival. Then, after I have confirmed their security, I will educate Mr. Voss on the consequences of touching my property. Vincent nodded and left to execute the order. Raphael resumed pacing, his mind a cold, analytical engine. Voss was the asset, not merely for retribution, but for intelligence. Klov's Chicago unit had remained dormant for years, adhering to established territorial boundaries. This assault was an unambiguous act of war, but it was poorly executed, and Klov was never poorly executed. Assaulting a pregnant woman in daylight was not their standard operational procedure, which suggested a disruption in their command hierarchy. The scenario indicated one of two possibilities. Either Voss provided Klov with false intelligence about Elena, or a subordinate within Klov's organization is acting autonomously. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. Moretti, she is conscious now, and she is requesting you. Raphael trailed her through sterile, uniform corridors, a labyrinth designed for the damaged. Recovery Room 4 was situated at the corridor's end, protected by two of his men. They acknowledged him as he approached. Inside, Elena was a diminished form within white linens, connected to a network of tubes and monitors that beeped her existence. Her eyes, however, were open, dark apertures that fixated on him the instant he entered. "Raphael," she whispered, her voice a fractured but beautiful sound. He crossed to the bed, carefully taking her hand. "I am here. Our daughter is secure. She is in the neonatal unit. She is small, Elena, but she is a survivor, like you." He swept the hair from her forehead, his touch a gentle contrast to the tempest within him. Tears traced silent paths down her cheeks. "He delivered me to them. Caleb." He simply opened the door and allowed them to take me. I was certain of my own termination. Her grip on his hand intensified. "They were seeking intelligence on you, your infrastructure, your finances. And when I refused to cooperate..." Her words disintegrated into a sob. I was convinced I would perish before I could ever hold her. Raphael leaned closer, pressing his forehead to hers in a silent, absolute contract. "You are not going to perish. Neither is she. I give you my word." "What is the operational plan?" It was the query he had anticipated, the one that would arm the device. He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "Is one required?" Elena examined his expression, registering the cold, hard certainty he made no effort to conceal. "He deserves a fate significantly worse than death. I am certain of that." "Then that is what you will deliver to him." Her voice was almost inaudible, but it was forged in steel. "Make him comprehend the gravity of his actions. Ensure he can never destroy another life." With a clinical gesture of possession, Raphael brushed his lips over her knuckles, issuing a directive. "Your objective is recovery. I will manage all other variables." "I require access to our child," she articulated, "upon reaching sufficient strength." He rose, displaying a conflict between tactical urgency and personal attachment. "Security will be established. Access will be contingent on my direct authorization." "Raphael," she vocalized, re-establishing physical contact, "I acknowledge your intervention." This affirmation served as a powerful narcissistic supply, as the alternative was incongruent with his self-concept. Always. Exchanging the sterile ward for the corridor, he consulted with Vincent. Voss is secured. They are en route to the Ashland facility. Affirmative. Raphael noted the time. 02:30. Has the intelligence from S been processed? 10 minutes ago. Your assessment was correct. It was Klov's operatives. The intelligence identifies two individuals, Alexei and Mikhail Petrov, as Klov's key enforcers. Vincent recited. The directive, however, was for psychological intimidation only, a demonstration of reach. A physiological stress response was observed in Raphael's jaw. Then explain the physical assault. Voss provided a false narrative of her possessing critical intelligence concerning next month's weapons transfer. Vincent's tone deviated from standard operational detachment. He manufactured a pretext for violence, calculating their methods would obscure his involvement. A tactically sound maneuver, yet a profoundly flawed strategic decision. Caleb Voss had initiated a high-risk gambit, attempting to neutralize a personal liability while satisfying Klov. His critical error was miscalculating Raphael's response matrix and intelligence capabilities. The Petrovs, what is their status? Under surveillance. Their last known location was a club in the Ukrainian village. Acquire them. I require them to be fully cognizant. Raphael proceeded to the exit. Also, assign a familiar operative to Elena's door. And your destination? Ning. I am proceeding to an interview with Mr. Voss. At 0300, the industrial district presented a landscape of dormant, decaying structures. Raphael's vehicle approached an unremarkable building with boarded windows and a 6-year-old condemnation notice. Internally, the environment was sterile, with filtered air and soundproofing, a chamber engineered for unmonitored discourse. Marcus, an operative whose history was visible in his scar tissue, provided brief. He is secured in the rear. He has been exhibiting emotional distress for the last 20 minutes. Appropriate. Raphael traversed the open space, navigating past inert shipping containers toward a purpose-built office. Caleb Voss was restrained in a steel chair, his attire compromised. His gaze fixed on Raphael's entry, displaying indicators of pure, primal fear. Raphael, thank God, he began. This is a significant error. I have no context for these events. Your operatives abducted me. Without responding, Raphael positioned a second chair directly facing him. Voss attempted another vocalization. Listen, if Elena is the catalyst, a full explanation is possible. Her behavior has been paranoid. I have been extremely concerned. Cease. Voss's vocalization stopped. Raphael initiated a period of observation. Caleb Voss, age 42, presented a carefully engineered public facade, projecting charisma and trustworthiness. His professional history was one of prosecuting others, earning him the title of the city's incorruptible district attorney. His career trajectory was optimal until this point. I will pose a single query. Raphael stated, his tone clinically neutral. Your entire future state is dependent on your response. Is that understood? Voss gave a frantic, nonverbal affirmation. Why? The motive is what interests me. Why did you deliver your pregnant wife to individuals you knew were capable of extreme violence? The question was delivered with unnerving calm. Was the primary driver avarice, fear, or ambition? I need to comprehend the psychological calculus that designates the carrier of one's child as acceptable collateral. Voss's constructed persona disintegrated. The outcome was not meant to be this. They assured me it was merely a conversation, a warning to you. You informed them she possessed knowledge of my indiscretions. It was a requirement. They were making demands. He paused, recognizing his self-incrimination. Necessary? Raphael mirrored, the word sharp. Because her lack of utility would have redirected their attention to you. Therefore, you presented her as a high-value asset to ensure they took the bait. He leaned forward. Inform me, Caleb. At what point did you rationalize that your wife's life was an equitable exchange for your gambling debts? I had no desire for her death. Voss vocalized through tears. I just required more time. I assessed she could withstand it. She possesses greater resilience than is immediately apparent. She is. Raphael administered a single, precise strike, an act of behavioral correction rather than rage, which split Voss's lip. Do not! Raphael's voice was devoid of affect. You have forfeited the right to speak of her resilience when you orchestrated this attempt to shatter it. Voss began weeping without restraint. Please, I am expressing extreme remorse. I will comply with any directive. That is correct. You will. Raphael stood, activating his phone. You will provide a complete account of your arrangement with Clov's syndicate. Every name, date, and financial figure, every communication, every transaction, every individual you compromised to preserve yourself. I cannot. They will terminate me. They are certainly welcome to make the attempt, Raphael replied, his smile showing no warmth. First, however, I will ensure you can no longer cause harm to anyone. This will not be accomplished through violence, Caleb. I will utilize the very system you profess to revere. The law. Voss's expression shifted from terror to utter confusion. What? As district attorney, you understand the mechanics of justice. Raphael signaled to Marcus, who produced a laptop. You are going to assist us in constructing a federal case against yourself. Financials, correspondence, all evidence of your corruption. Upon completion, you will be the central figure in a criminal conspiracy so vast and perfectly documented, you will perish in a facility you helped populate. That's not possible. I possess your financial records. I have surveillance footage of you escorting Elena to their vehicle. I have sworn testimony from your creditors, victims, and associates. Raphael's voice lowered to a conspiratorial tone. I merely require your cooperation to synthesize it, to make it irrefutable. And should you refuse? Raphael closed the distance until Voss could perceive the absolute lack of emotion in his eyes. Then I will release you. And then I will initiate contact with Dmitry Clov and explain how you manipulated his assets to attempt the murder of my unborn child without his authorization. He allowed the silence to intensify. How do you anticipate he will react, knowing you used his soldiers as disposable pawns, knowing you drew the full attention of federal agencies to his enterprise? All color vanished from Voss's face. He will. Precisely, therefore, you have two options. Cooperate and exist within a controlled environment, or refuse, and I will transmit all information to Clov before sunrise. Raphael straightened. The choice is yours to make. It required less than 30 seconds for Voss's psychological defenses to completely collapse. As dawn approached over Chicago, Raphael had acquired all necessary data. Voss provided information for 3 consecutive hours, each disclosure revealing deeper levels of depravity: wire fraud, extortion, evidence tampering. His criminal activities were extensive. Raphael observed as Marcus escorted Voss to a vehicle. He would be deposited near a police precinct in 2 hours. An anonymous report was already being filed. By midday, the information would saturate all city news outlets. His phone displayed an incoming communication from Vincent. "We have visual confirmation on the Hetroff brothers. Location?" Attempting to board a flight to Toronto. A pause followed. "Do you want us to intervene?" Raphael visualized Elena's face, her implicit preference for a non-violent path. He saw his daughter connected to machinery because 2 operatives classified her mother as collateral. No. Allow them to board the aircraft. Let them experience a brief sensation of relief. Let them process the illusion of a successful escape. Raphael's smile was glacial. Then open a channel to Clove. Inform him I require a meeting tonight and that he should be accompanied by his nephews. You are surrendering them to Clove? He authorized a strike on a pregnant woman based on unverified intelligence. His own operatives deviated from the protocol, escalating the operation into a public incident. That represents a failure of operational discipline, Vincent. The type of error that can destabilize an entire organization. Raphael was already moving toward the exit. Clove is of the old guard. He will perceive it as his obligation to sanitize his own network, and his methods will serve as a lesson on the consequences of violating protocol. You maintain plausible deniability. Precisely. I'm not initiating a territorial conflict over 2 operatives who cannot execute a simple command, but I am establishing that Elena is a non-negotiable asset. He entered the Mercedes. What is her condition? She is conscious and stable, and she is requesting your presence. The infant is viable. They anticipate she may be removed from the ventilator by tomorrow. Raphael released a breath, an unconscious somatic response to stress. I'm returning to the hospital. Arrange the Kozlov meeting for tonight. Use neutral ground. Vincent. Understood. Thank you. A beat of silence. Boss, she's one of us. We protect our own. Severing the call, Raphael steered the vehicle toward Chicago Memorial, the location of the 2 individuals now forming the entirety of his world. The city commenced its diurnal cycle around him. Trains swelled with passengers. Cafes hummed with activity, and the planet continued its rotation as if the previous night's violence were mere nightmare. It was not. And upon this conflict's resolution, Chicago's underworld would understand that Raphael Moretti's tolerance had a definitive threshold. Certain boundaries, once breached, cannot be restored. As he maneuvered the vehicle into a hospital parking space, his phone vibrated with a notification. A news bulletin. A prominent district attorney was apprehended in a sweeping citywide corruption operation. A phantom smile touched Raphael's lips. The conflagration was only just beginning. The room was saturated with the scent of antiseptic and a palpable sense of dread. Elena fixated on the ceiling tiles, enumerating the perforations in each one as a defense against a larger reality. 47 in the panel directly above. She verified the count 3 times. An hour prior, Raphael had departed to manage what he termed loose ends, a chilling euphemism for the violent, permanent removal of a liability. A soft knock on the door disrupted her dark rumination. The door opened, revealing not a medical professional, but a woman with a granite-like countenance. In her mid-50s, with gray hair in a tight bun, she wore a simple uniform of tailored trousers and a sweater. Her presence exuded a quiet authority, a quality Elena associated with survivors of unseen conflicts. This was Mrs. Voss. The woman's tone was polite yet strictly professional. My name is Catherine Ross. Mr. Moretti engaged my services to remain with you. When Elena attempted to sit up, the action was met with immediate regret. An acute pain lanced through her abdomen, stealing her breath. Catherine was instantly at her side, her touch both gentle and firm as she adjusted the pillows. Proceed with caution. You have undergone a significant surgical procedure. Your system requires a period of convalescence. I must see my daughter. That is the intention. The physicians simply require confirmation of your stability. Catherine occupied a chair adjacent to the bed. Mr. Moretti indicated you possess a refractory nature. I observe he was not inaccurate. A faint smile touched Elena's lips, a paradoxical response to her circumstances. So you have been in Raphael's employ for some time. Sufficiently long. I have served his organization for 12 years, primarily as a consultant on security matters. On other occasions, I manage scenarios demanding a more nuanced approach than Marcus or Tony can offer. She displayed a tablet. I am tasked with ensuring your safety and well-being. Any request you have will be met. What Elena required was her child in her arms and her husband deceased. But she repressed that singular desire deep within her psyche. What is transpiring outside of this room? The media coverage, specifically. Catherine's features constricted almost imperceptibly. You are unaware. My phone was confiscated. A hospital regulation during recovery. That may be advantageous. Nevertheless, Catherine positioned the tablet for Elena to view the headline. District Attorney Caleb Voss implicated in extensive corruption probe. Elena's eyes scanned the text, her cognitive processing lagging behind the visual input. Wire fraud, racketeering, evidence manipulation. The list of charges spanned 3 full paragraphs. Offshore accounts and recorded conversations with known felons had been uncovered. A documented trail proving Caleb was not merely corrupt, but a central figure in Chicago's criminal ecosystem. Elena's focus shifted to Catherine. This is Raphael's work. Mr. Moretti does not engage in partial solutions, but his ability to execute this overnight. Catherine retrieved the tablet. Your husband became complacent. He documented everything, believing it rendered him invulnerable. Raphael's team only needed to identify a starting point. She paused, and they required the persuasion of a key individual to guide them. The realization was immediate for Elena. Raphael had not just exposed Caleb, he had methodically deconstructed his entire life, leaving him only the prospect of a public trial. This was a fate worse than death. Caleb's existence was predicated on his public persona as a righteous prosecutor. That identity was now obliterated, and he would witness its incineration from a prison cell. He merited this outcome. Elena's voice was as sharp as steel. He delivered me to them as if I were chattel, as if our child held no value. I comprehend what you experienced. Catherine's voice softened. And I am profoundly sorry. No individual should be subjected to that. But I was, and I have survived. Elena locked her gaze with hers. Now, I require information on the subsequent phase. You will recuperate, and you will be with your daughter as soon as medically cleared. That is not my question. Elena pushed herself upright, disregarding her body's objections. Caleb's arrest will create significant repercussions. His associates and creditors will seek a target for their blame, and that target will be Raphael. Catherine observed her for a long moment. You are more perceptive than your demeanor suggests. I functioned as a translator for criminal syndicates for 5 years before I met Raphael. I understand the mechanics of these situations. Elena's hand tightened at the bedsheet. Caleb was involved in numerous enterprises. His removal creates a substantial power vacuum. Competitors will vie to occupy it. Mr. Moretti is fully cognizant of that fact. Is he prepared for the consequences? Before Catherine could respond, the door opened once more. It was Dr. Webb, appearing fatigued but satisfied. Positive news, he stated directly. Your daughter has been removed from the ventilator. She is breathing unassisted. The ensuing relief was so profound it nearly left her breathless. May I see her? Not at this moment. You lack the required mobility, but a video call can be arranged. Webb produced his phone. I have already taken the initiative to prepare it. Elena's hand trembled as she accepted the device. The display showed a transparent incubator within the neonatal unit. Inside, impossibly small and swaddled in blankets, was her infant. She possessed Raphael's dark hair and Elena's nose. Her eyes were shut, but her small chest moved with a flawless, steady cadence. A nurse was present, monitoring equipment and making notations. She is so beautiful, Elena murmured. She is a small combatant. To be born at 29 weeks and to be breathing independently already is quite remarkable. Webb smiled. Have you selected a name? Elena had not. A list existed from before. Names she and Caleb had reviewed, recorded on a legal notepad. Every name on it now seemed to belong to a different life. Sophia. The name manifested in her consciousness, fitting with such perfection it felt preordained. Her name is Sophia. Sophia Voss. Sophia Moretti. Elena's voice was resolute. She is Raphael's daughter. She will bear his name. Webb offered no comment on the inevitable legal complexities. He simply nodded and made a note. I will have the birth certificate documents amended. For the present, continue to rest. The faster your recovery, the sooner you may hold her. He departed. Elena continued to gaze at Sophia's image on the screen until tears blurred her vision. Catherine rested a hand on her shoulder. She is going to be all right. Both of you are. I know. Elena wiped her eyes. I cannot stop considering what might have happened had I not escaped. Had they succeeded in stopping my breath before I reached that cab? But you did escape. You prevailed. It was fortune. One of them had a momentary lapse in attention, and I fled. Elena's voice fractured. That is not strength. It is contingency. Contingency is merely surviving the initial assault. Catherine's tone became as hard as flint. Strength is the response that follows. You propelled yourself into that taxi, hemorrhaging and in labor, and forced yourself to a safe location. You provided the hospital with Raphael's name, aware of the chaos it would ignite. That is not contingency, Elena. That is a calculated action. For the first time, Elena perceived her clearly. Catherine's eyes held a wisdom forged only by extreme adversity. You have experienced this. A different scenario, but the identical anguish. Catherine resettled into the chair. I was once in the financial sector. I had a promising career, a husband, a conventional life. Then my husband became entangled with the wrong individuals, accumulating debts he could not service. They arrived at our home one evening to specify the terms of his failure. What was your response? I liquidated every asset we possessed to satisfy them. Then I initiated divorce proceedings, reverted to my maiden name, and effectively vanished. Catherine's smile was like a scar. 6 months later, I encountered Mr. Moretti at a fundraising event. We conversed, and he presented me with a job offer. He stated a need for personnel with a non-criminal perspective who understood how to react when systems fail. Does she grieve for her former life? Unquestionably, on a daily basis. But Catherine frames it with brutal simplicity. A life of purpose is superior to the alternative. Elena, her focus locked on her daughter's image, is resolved to transcend victimhood. Catherine leans closer, delivering a stark truth. Currently, the world perceives you as a fractured object. You can embody that perception, or you can rewrite the narrative. How? You observe, you study the key figures. You become more than the translator. Catherine's voice dropped. Look, it is clear Raphael has affection for you, but in his world, affection is insufficient. You must demonstrate the capacity to maintain composure when everything collapses. Catherine's cold, incisive logic impacts Elena like a physical force, a harsh reawakening. So you propose I integrate into his world? Catherine's gaze was unwavering. My dear, you are already a part of it. You carry his child. His name is your sole defense. This is your new reality. She rises, presenting the ultimate ultimatum. Be the casualty or ascend to the role of queen. As if cued by the moment's gravity, Elena's burner phone, retrieved from her purse by Catherine, vibrates. A restricted number. The message is designed to turn blood to ice. Your daughter is a lovely child. It would be a profound shame if she were harmed. A profound neurogenic shock is observed as the subject, Elena. The associate, Catherine, correctly interprets her facial distress and confiscates the mobile device. Catherine's own expression becomes affectless, a mask of tactical resolve. You will remain in this room. You are not to move. You will open this door for me or Mr. Moretti only. Following her departure, the lock's mechanism audibly secures the environment. Elena fixates on the screen, experiencing acute tachycardia. They possess my contact data. They are aware of Sophia. My offspring is the target. A primal rage then displaces the fear state, stabilizing her motor functions. She transmits the message to Raphael and initiates a call. He responds instantly. Elena, a threat has been issued against Sophia. The subsequent silence registered with greater intensity than any vocalization. When Raphael resumes communication, his vocal tone is preternaturally composed, a more alarming indicator than overt aggression. Transmit the message. I have already. Received. Is Catherine present? She has just departed. Raphael, what was their vector for my number, their source of information? That is yet unknown, but I will ascertain it. The sound of a vehicle door is audible. My proximity is 10 minutes. Do not vacate that room. I am remaining stationary. And Sophia? Vincent is already at the medical facility. A full security detail was assigned to her at birth. His tone modulates, becoming fractionally less severe. She is secure, Elena, I assure you. The connection terminated. Elena remained with the device, sensing a foundational psychological shift within herself. Catherine's assessment was accurate. The subject had maintained a cognitive dissonance, a fantasy of separate realities where Raphael's world could not intrude. A flawed construct. Uttering his name in that trauma center constituted a loyalty oath. She now faced the necessity of learning her new reality's protocols. 15 minutes later, the door opens. It is Raphael, but he exhibits signs of extreme stress, appearing significantly older. He approaches directly, containing her in a cautious embrace. while mindful of her injuries. His hold is firm enough to transmit his own agitated heart rate. "My apologies," he vocalizes, his voice raw. "This is my failing, a breach in my security. This is not your culpability. It belongs to the message's sender." Elena creates distance, establishing eye contact. "Do you have an identification?" "We are tracking the signal. It is a disposable device, but all entities leave a trace." He sits, his hand enveloping hers. Vincent is managing it. If this is one of Kozlov's operatives— "It is not," Elena interjects, her certainty notable. "Kozlov issues warnings. He does not authorize assassinations. His subordinates went rogue, a situation he must contain. This is a new actor, one who knows of Sophia and is willing to leverage her." Raphael observes her, his expression a carefully controlled, neutral mask. "You have analyzed this." "I have had limited alternative cognitive activities." Her grip on him intensifies. "Catherine instructed me to cease being a passive observer. She was correct. I require a schematic of your world to effectively protect our daughter." "That is not a burden you are required to assume." "Yes, it is," Elena retorts, her tone sharp. "I cannot remain sequestered in your fortress indefinitely, Raphael. The perimeter will eventually be breached. When it is, I must be prepared." He remains silent for a protracted moment, then offers a slow, measured nod. "Very well. What information do you require?" "Everything. However, let us begin with who gains the most by threatening my child." A dark, approving smile forms on Raphael's lips. "You are already exhibiting strategic thought." He activates his phone, displaying a diagram, a complex network of the city's criminal hierarchy. "Chicago has 3 dominant powers. My organization manages high-level operations, asset laundering, political influence, and legitimate enterprises. Kozlov's enterprises next. They control street-level rackets, narcotics protection, and trafficking. Finally, there are the Morellis." "Halt," she says, interrupting him. "Your surname is Moretti. A common name. With that specific family branch, relations are strained. Raphael magnifies one section of the network. They control the south side, gambling, usury, construction. For years, a precarious truce held. Each faction maintained its territory. Then Caleb was arrested." A tick manifests in Raphael's jaw. "You must comprehend, your former spouse was not merely a corrupt officer. He was an asset. He resolved issues for influential men. With him removed, a frantic effort to conceal the past is underway. And you're the focal point of their blame. They know I am with you. I ensured they did." His gaze is intense, conveying a formidable purpose. "I wanted it known. I wanted the entire city to understand the consequences of harming you." Elena's throat constricts. "And that is why they leveraged Sophia to force you into a compromised position." "Alternatively," Raphael counters, moving toward the window, "they wish to incite open conflict. If I retaliate, I appear impulsive. If I do not, I appear weak. In either scenario, another party benefits." "Who?" But Vincent's appearance in the doorway preempts his response. His face is devoid of emotion, a state Elena recognizes as catastrophic. "We traced the phone," Vincent reports. "The findings are complex." "State them." "Purchased with cash 3 weeks ago in Chinatown. Surveillance cameras captured the purchaser, a male in his 20s, in a courier uniform. Vincent displays a photograph on his phone. Facial recognition provides the name Danny Morelli, a low-level operative for the Southside family. Raphael becomes completely motionless. Are you certain? 100%. It escalates. Danny's elder brother, Michael, was incarcerated by Caleb 2 years ago. Fabricated evidence, compensated witnesses. The entire case was a pretext to settle old disputes. Allow me to infer, Raphael says, his voice dangerously quiet. You possess the evidence. Caleb's private records contained everything. Michael Morelli was framed. Vincent's tone is flat, lifeless. Now that Caleb is arrested, his past cases are under review. Michael's counsel has just filed for an appeal. The complete grim paradigm crystallizes for Elena. So, Danny holds Raphael responsible for his brother's justice, but for its delayed arrival. Had Caleb remained free, Michael would have expired in prison. Vincent adds, he has stage 4 cancer. His release is only occurring because the original case is collapsing. Raphael vocalizes a soft curse. This is not a strategic maneuver. This is personal retribution. There is more, Vincent states, his expression grim. We just received intelligence. 3 of our secure locations were compromised in the last hour. Coordinated incursions. Nothing was stolen. They left a message on the walls. What was the message? A statement. You violated the code. Now we will violate you. The room is enveloped in a profound, cold silence. Elena observes the realization settle in Raphael. The persona of the concerned partner dissolves, supplanted by a colder, more lethal aspect. Who is aware of Sophia's existence? His voice is like a sliver of ice. The medical staff, our inner circle, and any individual monitoring the neonatal unit. Vincent presents a second image, a low-resolution still from a security camera. A male in surgical attire, his features obscured by shadow, is seen near the NICU entrance. He has been present for 3 hours. He is not an employee. Raphael moves with extreme velocity, a fluid motion that vacates the room before Elena can react. Vincent follows closely. She stands alone, facing the doorway's emptiness. Her daughter is now an entry on a list. Raphael's organization was under assault, and she was contained in a sterile room, a passive target. 5 minutes later, Catherine re-enters, the lock engaging with somber finality. There is an additional complication. I am aware, Vincent informed us. No, this is a new development. Catherine's expression is rigid. I have received a communication from our asset. Law enforcement is mobilizing. They will execute raids on every known property of Mr. Moretti at dawn. All of them? They require probable cause for that. They now possess it. An informant has been supplying them with disinformation, falsified logs, phantom financial records, and a sworn affidavit. Catherine sinks into a chair. It is entirely fabricated, but it is a masterfully constructed falsehood, more than sufficient for the warrants. Elena's cognitive processes accelerate, linking the disparate events, a multi-pronged attack conducted with tactical precision, the threat against Sophia, the attacks on his safe houses, and now the legal assault. An entity is attempting to dismantle Raphael's world in a single night. The Morellis lack this level of strategic capability. No, Elena breathes, but Caleb possessed it. She displays an article on her phone, its light casting a cold, blue hue upon her. Observe the chronology. He is arrested. His former syndicates begin to collapse. And then this perfectly synchronized assault is initiated against Raphael. Catherine inspects the screen, her eyes tracing the text before widening. You believe he prepared this before his capture? A contingency plan? I believe he anticipated Raphael would pursue him. He created a dead man's switch. Elena's fingers move swiftly across the device, searching for the underlying pattern. If Caleb is neutralized, he ensures Raphael is also neutralized. He leaks falsified intelligence to federal authorities. He reignites conflicts with rival organizations. The entire structure is designed for a cascading failure. That is both brilliant and pathologically unstable. Elena looks up. What is Raphael's location? He is in the NICU. He is relocating Sophia to a secure private medical facility. Good. We must. The environment ceases to exist, plunging the room into total darkness. An instant later, red emergency lighting activates, casting the walls in a sanguine color. From the hallway, screams are heard, acute, terrified, followed by the sound of a panicked exodus. Catherine is already standing, a firearm now present in her hand. Get down! What is occurring? The situation is unknown, but we will not remain here to ascertain it. Subject Catherine exhibited phantom-like movement, pressing her ear to the door in a display of tactical awareness. Can you stand? Pain registered as a sharp, visceral response in Elena's abdomen, yet she initiated movement. I'll have to. This statement indicated a high tolerance for distress. Catherine became a stabilizing force in the escalating chaotic environment. We're moving to the NICU. Stay behind me. If you see a face you don't know, you do nothing. Boy. 3 steps were achieved before the door did not open, but was breached explosively. A large male subject in tactical gear filled the splintered frame. His weapon was oriented toward Elena's center mass. Catherine's response was a single, precise gunshot. The subject collapsed, but a successive wave of hostiles followed. Elena fell back as Catherine engaged again, a display of lethal efficiency under fire. 2 additional hostiles were neutralized, but the corridor was now saturated with armed subjects who were not affiliated with security. Back! The command was sharp as Catherine tactically repositioned Elena toward the bathroom. The space was a confined kill zone, a tactical liability, yet their sole option. They crossed the threshold as a volley of rounds shredded the doorframe. Catherine secured the door, improvising a barricade. We're boxed in! Elena's communication device vibrated. With somatic tremors evident in her hands, she typed, "Room compromised. C is with me. Where are you?" The reply was instantaneous. Hold your ground. 2 minutes. He's coming, Elena vocalized. He won't make it. Agent Catherine ejected a spent magazine with a metallic click. I have approximately 20 rounds left. After that, the situation becomes less predictable. Subject Elena's cognitive process escalated, recontextualizing the confined space from a cage to a strategic map. The high window was deemed non-viable, the equipment mere obstruction. The ventilation grate, however, was identified as a tactical opportunity. She articulated a plan to which Catherine acknowledged the logic but showed hesitation regarding Elena's role. I'm the bait, Elena stated, her vocal tone showing a lack of fear. This was not a sacrificial gesture, but a strategic calculation. In that moment, her reasoning mirrored Raphael's own ruthless logic. Intellect, not force, is the primary weapon. A slow expression of dawning professional respect manifested on Catherine's face. Catherine ascended, infiltrated the ventilation system, and was absorbed by the darkness, leaving subject Elena in a state of calculated isolation. The door groaned under a concentrated assault before its hinges failed. An armed hostile entered, displaying a predatory expression upon viewing his cornered subject. Then the tactical situation inverted. Catherine descended from the ceiling, an unexpected vertical assault vector. 3 controlled shots echoed. 3 hostiles were neutralized. As the remaining assailants recoiled in disorientation, Raphael appeared at the ingress point, completing fatal funnel. He did not merely enter the room. His presence dominated the space. Subjects Marcus and Tony appeared at his flanks, functioning as extensions of his controlled aggression. The trio operated as a single combat unit, a demonstration of brutal efficiency that neutralized the assault team in under 30 seconds. He was immediately at Elena's side, his hands conducting a rapid trauma assessment, his voice conveying urgency. Sophia was secure with Vincent. He initiated physical contact, the residual adrenaline from the conflict still palpable. The hospital was a hostile environment. A wheelchair was procured as Elena's motor functions failed. The group moving as a cohesive unit through the blood-strewn corridors. The NICU had been repurposed into a fortified position, a sterile bastion secured by Vincent and 4 armed men. Within, the infant Sophia remained in stasis, oblivious to the external environmental collapse. Vincent outlined the exfiltration protocol. A private medical evacuation vehicle was on standby on the roof. 20 minutes to a secure site. Raphael's silent nod served as confirmation. They relocated the incubator with the precision of an ordnance disposal team. Catherine remained beside Elena's chair, a stoic, granite-like presence. Elena's inquiry was a quiet whisper. Who were they? Raphael's response was a single clinical classification that filled the air. Mercenaries. The assailants were professionals, their attack a calculated operation designed to mimic a law enforcement action, a venture of significant financial cost. The Morellis were the primary suspects, or a third party using their identity as a facade. Raphael knelt before her, establishing direct eye contact as he delivered his prognosis. This conflict would escalate before it resolved, and he would need to place her in a secure, isolated location. Her dissent was quiet but firm. She presented a new tactical assessment. Isolating her would make her a more vulnerable target. Their optimal defense was cohesion. She was wounded but in a state of recovery, and she was adapting. She was no longer a liability. She was evolving into a strategic asset. I am not requesting to be a combatant in your war, she articulated, her voice stable. I am requesting to be integrated into the strategy. Raphael's gaze shifted to Catherine, who offered a minute, non-committal gesture. The subject's logic was cold and sound. An isolated target is a neutralized target. Elena's tactical instincts had already proven effective. After a prolonged, silent assessment, Raphael conceded, issuing a single directive. Catherine's authority was now absolute. The route to the roof was clear. The 18-minute flight was a transit over a grid of city lights toward a concrete compound north of the urban center. Upon landing, Sophia began to cry, her vocalization announcing her entry into this new, hostile environment. In a room more akin to a bunker than a bedroom, Elena made initial maternal contact with her daughter, a presence both profound and fragile. She vocalized a promise into the infant's hair, that this generational pattern of violence would terminate with her. From the shadowed doorway, Raphael observed, forming his own internal objective of total annihilation against their adversaries. "I know," she said, meeting his gaze. "But we have to be strategic about it." So she countered his destructive impulse not with placation, but with architecture. "Any amateur can apply destructive force," she explained. "True mastery lies in building a lasting power structure." His smile was sharp as he amended her statement. They would build an empire. The city below was dormant, a sleeping organism unaware of the conflict developing within its systems. A single subject introduced through a violent incident was now altering the brutal calculus of its criminal enterprise. The phase of Elena Moretti, the pawn, had concluded. The queen was now analyzing the board. Surrounded by 40 acres of woodland, the sanctuary's perceived peace became menacing as light failed. At 3 a.m., the infant Sophia's cries drew Elena into the darkness. Through the window, spectral guards patrolled the grounds. A dozen observed, more inferred. Raphael was constructing a fortress. "No rest for you," Catherine noted, a silhouette in the doorway holding a warm beverage. "She requires feeding every 2 hours," Elena reported, her voice strained as a pain response contracted her frame. Medical personnel had assured her this was normal, but each feeding cycle was experienced as a significant drain on her vital resources. "You have been awake for 3 days," Catherine observed, her analytical gaze softening on Sophia as she offered to assume care of the child. Elena declined, bound to the schedule, each movement a painful reminder of her injuries. Her own inquiry about Catherine's sustained alertness revealed a darker truth. Raphael was in a meeting that had commenced hours prior and had not concluded. Elena's focus sharpened instantly. This was not a commercial negotiation, but a council of war, a forum where men, as Catherine described, dispassionately determine survival outcomes. "Would you prefer the unmitigated truth," Catherine asked, "or the palliative falsehood that this environment is not yours?" Upon Elena's assent, the briefing began. The hospital attack was not random. It was a surgical strike, both precise and costly. Raphael's financial analysis estimated the expenditure for the mercenaries to be in excess of $2 million, a figure beyond the Morelli's liquid assets. They had a benefactor. On her tablet, Catherine displayed the profile of Antonio Morelli, the 60-year-old patriarch who had operated for 40 years, consistently evading prosecution. Raphael had operated under the assumption of a standing truce between their organizations, a fragile equilibrium now shattered. A second profile appeared. Marco, Antonio's grandson, in his late 20s, and exhibiting a strong drive for power. For years, he had advocated for a northern expansion, a strategy his grandfather suppressed to avoid federal attention. However, Caleb's incarceration created a power vacuum, and Marco likely perceived a strategic opening. Elena's assessment of Marco's photograph identified a dangerous combination of entitlement and aggression. This, she concluded, was the individual who had ordered her termination. The strategic picture, however, was complex. Danny Morelli, the conflict's initiator, was not aligned with Marco. His allegiance was to his uncle, Sal Morelli, whose faction was engaged in protracted internal feud with Antonio's branch of the family. They were distinct power centers with a multi-year history of animosity. Danny's motivation was not territorial, it was a campaign of pure retribution. His brother, Michael, was incarcerated for a crime orchestrated by Caleb. In Danny's distorted rationale, Raphael carried culpability for Caleb's delayed exposure, making him a target for retaliation. Two distinct fronts had materialized: Marco's war for power and Danny's war for blood. "Are they allies?" The query remained, the central enigma. This was the intelligence problem Raphael and his command were attempting to resolve. As if triggered by the thought, Catherine mentioned the council was concluding and that Raphael would require a debrief with Elena. "He doesn't have to," Elena began, but Catherine interjected. "Believe me, he does." All parameters had shifted. Elena was no longer merely his romantic partner. She was the mother of his heir. Her position on the strategic map was now fixed. The only remaining variable was the function she would serve. The sound of approaching footsteps signaled his arrival. Raphael appeared, displaying the physiological markers of command stress. "The subject exhibits cognitive fatigue," he observed, his articulation slowed. "As do you," she responded. He registered Catherine's nod, a confirmation that Elena now grasped the complex architecture of their crisis. Raphael processed the data, drew a chair, and presented the tactical assessment. They faced a multi-vector conflict: Marco's ambition, Danny's vengeful psychosis, and an unknown internal agent. This phantom operative was causing a hemorrhage of intelligence to federal entities. The threat was not external, but systemic. A visible stress response manifested as Raphael's jaw tensed, fracturing his stoic facade. "An informant!" The term was delivered with the clinical finality of a terminal diagnosis. Elena absorbed its psychological poison. It signified not mere betrayal, but induced paranoia and the dissolution of trust. When asked for a subject, he confirmed Vincent was auditing all core personnel. The group was small, composed of loyalists, a fact creating a cognitive dissonance Raphael struggled to reconcile. Elena repositioned the infant, a symbol of life in an environment of decay. Could Caleb have initiated this infiltration? The thought registered as an acute, paranoid ideation in Raphael's mind. A 2-year period offered ample opportunity to compromise an individual with latent greed or a narcissistic wound. Catherine posited another theory: a subject denied advancement now nursing a grievance. Marcus began a review of personnel files. Raphael's instinct was for immediate, decisive action, a response he suppressed. It was 4 a.m. He required a 6-hour cognitive reset. Elena's logic was a sharp counterpoint. Any delay in securing the leak would result in further asset degradation. To engage while cognitively impaired, Raphael argued, presented an unacceptable risk of catastrophic error. Kneeling beside her, his hand on Sophia, he stated his mind was a weapon that required sharpening. The profound fatigue etched on his features served as evidence, and Elena conceded before requesting the strategic outline. Phase 1 was a summit with Antonio Morelli in a neutral zone. The objective was to ascertain if Marco operated with his grandfather's endorsement or as a rogue element. Raphael's vocal affect became flat. If Marco was unsanctioned, Antonio would restrain him. If not, the young man would serve as a powerful deterrent example. The chilling resolve in his voice, rather than inducing fear, acted as a stabilizing agent for her. This was the individual who had systematically dismantled a hospital, who had defied mortality to ensure her survival. He was her selection. Her focus shifted to Danny. Raphael categorized him as an alternate threat profile. His grief was authentic, his rage a pure, if misdirected, force. Such an emotional state is not susceptible to negotiation. Vincent had recommended a solution mimicking a fatal accident. Raphael, observing his own reflection, admitted he remained undecided on the course of action. Terminating Danny would only reinforce his family's martyrdom narrative. Allowing him to live, however, guaranteed a prolonged war of psychological attrition. There was no optimal path. Feeling Sophia's heartbeat, Elena proposed a third protocol. provide Danny with his stated objective. Both Raphael and Catherine regarded her with emergent interest. She detailed the plan. Danny sought justice for his brother, Michael, incarcerated for Caleb's offense. Her vocal confidence increased. They would leak the complete intelligence file, exposing Caleb's manipulation and transforming Michael into a symbol of injustice. This would not restore the lost years. No, she acknowledged, but it would validate Michael's experience and inflict a profound psychological wound on Caleb that no prison could replicate. Her gaze locked with Raphael's. You sought to condition Caleb. This tactic makes him a social pariah. A low sound from Catherine signified approval of a strategy she deemed both ruthless and elegant. Elena specified that since Danny's conflict was rooted in a perceived injustice, they would deliver a resolution. It might sate his drive for retribution. It might not. But it was an opening gambit that did not require a casualty. Raphael observed her in a prolonged silence, which concluded with a slow, approving smile. He commented that she had devoted significant cognitive resources to this problem. She replied that she'd had no other focus. Vincent, who preferred definitive outcomes, would object to this strategy. Raphael dismissed this, stating Vincent's emotional response was irrelevant, his compliance was not. As she adjusted Sophia, Elena clarified the tactic was not about trusting Danny, but about offering him a choice, a nonviolent path to his goal. His refusal would legitimize a more aggressive response, but only after a de-escalation was attempted. As she began to depart, his hand on hers arrested her movement. Elena, my thanks. For what? She inquired. For illuminating a strategic option I failed to perceive. He drew her closer, mindful of the child between them. For superior strategic modeling. She dismissed the praise, attributing it to a different analytical framework. She advised him to enter a sleep cycle to prepare for the coming events. He released her with visible reluctance. Catherine followed Elena to the nursery, a space resembling a tactical operations center. A brilliant maneuver, Catherine stated quietly. You just transitioned from protected asset to a power player. Was my intent that transparent? No, Catherine grinned. But his reaction was, he's too cognitively overloaded to process it fully yet. But at dawn, he will, and he will be in awe. Adjusting Sophia's blanket, Elena asked Catherine if it was merely a calculated maneuver. Catherine defined it as intelligent adaptation for survival. In their ecosystem, she explained, value is determined by internal capabilities, not external associations. Tonight, Elena demonstrated a strategist's intellect, the only viable currency. The concept of engaging in psychological games with him was repellent to Elena. You are not playing, you are ascending, Catherine corrected, her gaze sweeping a bank of monitors. 3 days ago, you were in a critical care unit. Tonight, you are developing strategy from a fortress while your daughter sleeps meters from an arsenal. This is a severe environmental adjustment, Elena confessed, feeling the pressure of the enclosed space. A choice always exists, Catherine countered with intensity. You occupy a position of power, and that requires a warrior's mindset. She then provided a piece of tactical advice. Do not attempt to emulate Raphael or his operators. They will classify you as a traumatized amateur, invert that perception, and weaponize it. A dangerous light appeared in Catherine's eyes. Allow them to misidentify you as fragile, then deconstruct their entire operational reality. Elena's mind recalled instances where her own insights had identified tactical vulnerabilities the men had completely overlooked. I can execute that, she affirmed in a low voice. I am certain you can, Catherine confirmed before exiting. Alone, Elena observed her daughter, a 3-day-old asset in a conflict beyond her comprehension. I will secure this environment for you, Elena vowed, regardless of the cost. Sleep became an unattainable state, fragmented by Sophia's vocalizations and the movements of armed sentries. At dawn, she ceased the attempt, carrying Sophia downstairs, drawn by the scent of coffee to a kitchen designed for a grand residence, not a hardened facility. Raphael was positioned between Vincent and Marcus, all 3 subjects illuminated by laptops as if sleep were a biological irrelevance. Morning, Elena announced, placing Sophia's bassinet on the tile. 3 heads turned toward her. Marcus offered a rare, slight smile. The little boss is awake. They both are, Vincent noted, pouring her coffee. What is your status? Sore, depleted, and I need a complete intelligence update, she stated, accepting the mug. Have you identified the source of the leak? Raphael and Vincent exchanged a significant look. We have a working hypothesis. An accountant, Peter Chen, has been exhibiting anomalous behaviors, avoiding contact, displaying anxiety, offering weak rationalizations. Marcus's financial analysis revealed several irregular wire transfers. Define irregular. $50,000, 3 discrete payments over the preceding 2 months. Raphael's screen displayed the data trail. The funds originated from a shell corporation with ties to a law firm previously associated with Caleb Voss. The implication struck Elena with physical force. Caleb had purchased his allegiance. What is Peter's tenure? 8 years. A flawless service record without a single negative indicator, Raphael stated, his voice infused with contempt. He has full clearance. Our financial assets, our properties, our personnel manifest. If he has been transmitting data to Caleb's network, our entire infrastructure is compromised. His location? A secure facility in the suburbs. We acquired him an hour ago, Marcus reported, flexing his hands. We are awaiting your directive for the next operational phase. Raphael's facial expression became a stoic mask. I require a direct interrogation first. I need to ascertain what he compromised, identify his handler, their objective, and then... Elena's voice was devoid of affect. Then we permanently resolve the security threat. Elena drank her coffee, her mind processing variables. May I suggest an alternative course of action? Vincent's brow arched. Proceed. Before you terminate the asset, we should leverage him. She put her cup down. If Peter's handler anticipates further intelligence, we will provide it. However, this time we will control the narrative. Raphael became perfectly motionless. You are proposing we turn him? No, I am proposing we aim him. A new paradigm emerged in silence, utilizing Peter as a vector for disinformation, a deliberately compromised asset to bait an unidentified hostile actor. Elena visualized a meticulously crafted simulation of organizational weakness, designed to precipitate a devastating counteroffensive. The strategic elegance of the concept was palpable as Vincent began to detail its implementation, preparing to disseminate fabricated intelligence on tactical positions and security measures. Raphael articulated the primary risk, the possibility of a secondary betrayal by Peter. But Elena's certainty was unshakable. His compliance would be absolute, secured through a direct, one-on-one, psychological intervention. The subject, Peter, was to internalize his existence as conditional upon total submission, with constant monitoring to enforce the paradigm. Raphael assessed her, noting the cold, strategic framework underlying her proposal. She presented the plan not as clemency, but as a more strenuous and useful path than mere termination. Her logic was unassailable. Vincent affirmed her new status as a key strategist, as Marcus advocated for proactive entrapment rather than awaiting another assault. Raphael acquiesced, signaling his consent with a slight inclination of his head. He imposed a single stipulation: her presence was required during Peter's debriefing. As the architect of the strategy, she must observe its initial application. Raphael's intent was a form of psychological conditioning. Peter had to confront the individuals his perfidy nearly eliminated. This, Raphael noted, was a powerful stimulus. She would have Catherine's assistance, but her attendance was non-negotiable to witness the consequence of her own design. The objective was to make him face Sophia, a living symbol of what his betrayal had targeted for destruction. Elena consented, requesting only 1 hour to compose herself. With a meeting arranged with Antonio Morelli, a 2-hour time frame existed to conclude the Peter situation. The subsequent hour was a dissociative state, blending protective maternal behaviors with mental preparation, two incongruent realities. Catherine provided a specific attire: dark pants, a plain sweater, flat boots, and one concise instruction: allow Raphael to manifest the monstrous archetype. You are to be the human repercussion. Their destination was an unremarkable suburban residence, its mundane exterior masking a fortified location. Within this containment unit, Peter Chen was restrained in a chair, his physical condition mirroring his psychological collapse. Elena's appearance with Sophia in her arms elicited an immediate, audible shock from him. Raphael's salutation was unnervingly subdued, juxtaposing Peter's state with the decision he made 8 weeks ago to betray them. Raphael commenced a methodical deconstruction of Peter's psychological defenses. The subject's protestations collapsed against irrefutable financial data connecting him to Caleb Voss's organization. The inquiry was never about the act itself, but its underlying motivation. After Raphael enumerated 8 years of established trust and equitable reward, the catalyst was revealed. It was his daughter. For the first time, Peter's gaze met Elena's, his vocal control failing as he described the child's leukemia, a disclosure that violently reconfigured the room's moral framework. He recounted the grim specifics: a clinical drug trial his insurance carrier declined to cover, inducing a state of desperation. This desperation led him to a contact who provided currency for intelligence. The terms were $50,000 upfront for a continuous data stream. Peter tried to portray his complicity as unwitting, asserting he was told the information was for market research. He maintained the delusion he never foresaw his actions precipitating a lethal assault, a willful denial of his operational environment. Raphael dismantled this self-deception, observing that intelligence within their profession is never utilized for innocuous ends. Peter's tearful query, "What was I supposed to do?" triggered a cognitive dissonance in Elena. She experienced the acute empathy of a parent's dread alongside the cold rage of a survivor. Raphael then articulated the protocol Peter had violated. He should have sought assistance internally, relying on the principle that the organization provides for its members. His betrayal, instead, had exposed every member of their structure to existential threat. Raphael dismissed Peter's apologies as irrelevant data against the magnitude of the harm. He made the outcome clinically vivid, detailing how Peter's information guided an armed team to a hospital to terminate Elena post-childbirth, almost orphaning her infant. Peter's weak claim of ignorance was met with a final, precise diagnosis. He accepted the lie, as it was less psychologically taxing than confronting his actual conduct. With a voice devoid of emotional inflection, Elena pronounced her own assessment of his catastrophic choice. When Peter pleaded to know his disposition, Raphael presented not termination but a life of indentured service. He detailed the counterintelligence operation, where Peter would function as their controlled asset. Any departure from the script provided by Raphael's team would trigger his immediate elimination. Peter's frantic compliance was met with Raphael's detached laugh when he begged for his family's safety. Raphael assigned full culpability for his family's jeopardy directly to Peter. With a gesture, he had Marcus move him to the basement for continuous surveillance. In the ensuing silence, Elena processed the moral ambiguity, confessing to an internal conflict between empathy and profound hostility. She questioned if this new state made her monstrous. Raphael corrected her. It simply affirmed her humanity. He drew her into an embrace, validating that Peter had constructed his own outcome. "He could have solicited our support," Raphael articulated. "I would have financed his daughter's treatment without condition." Instead, Peter's actions created a near-fatal outcome for Elena, thereby erasing any residual empathy Raphael might have possessed. Peter's prognosis was now a cold calculation, contingent on his utility versus the damage he inflicted. As this stark reality settled, Raphael announced their next engagement, a meeting with Antonio Morelli in 2 hours, where Elena's presence was now compulsory. She was now a primary component in this engagement, and Raphael insisted Antonio witness the human collateral of his grandson's impulsive gambit. Furthermore, he required her there as a human barometer to assess the old man's authenticity. Their 3-vehicle convoy moved through the city toward another secure site. While Sophia slept, Catherine outfitted Elena in a different form of defense. A subdued but powerful attire engineered to project authority, not victimhood. The objective was to present her as a sovereign entity, not a sacrificial pawn. Raphael selected one of his own establishments, a controlled environment for the impending confrontation. Antonio Morelli appeared precisely on time, flanked by 2 impassive guards. Morelli was of slight stature, but dominated the space with a palpable authority, his eyes performing a rapid environmental assessment. His focus on Elena and Sophia briefly softened. Raphael leveraged their presence, ensuring Antonio perceived the life his grandson had so carelessly jeopardized. Antonio occupied his chair as his security detail controlled the exits, a classic tableau of established dominance. The opening gambit, a veiled allusion to Marco's unauthorized conflict, was met with a cold rebuttal. Raphael's objective was not social but diagnostic. He needed to determine if Marco was a rogue element or a proxy directed by his grandfather. The methodical violence, the hospital raid, the contract killers, implied a single, well-funded orchestrator. When Antonio suggested Marco's autonomy, Raphael presented his evidence, a manila file containing a record of betrayal showing how $2 million was being diverted from accounts linked to Antonio's shipping enterprise. Antonio processed the data, his expression a disciplined facade of control. Yet Elena, with a newly developed acuity, detected the minute tensing of a jaw muscle that betrayed the patriarch's composure. Raphael capitalized on the advantage, framing the issue not as an indictment but as a matter of direct liability. The fund's origin was a Morelli internal issue. It became Raphael's concern when used to finance an assault on his family. Antonio placed the file down as if it were an explosive device. His inquiry about an equitable settlement for Marco's indiscretion was met with a non-negotiable demand, delivered in a tone of absolute resolve. Public exile, full financial restitution, and a formal apology. The required assurance of future stability remained in the tense silence, a direct challenge to Antonio's control over his own bloodline. Raphael's alternative was brutally clear. He would resolve the Marco situation himself, an action with a predictable and permanent result. In the oppressive quiet, Elena held Sophia, a vulnerable icon of the innocents trapped in this conflict. This was a dialogue where each phrase was a potential casus belli. Raphael was offering Antonio an exit from a mutually destructive scenario, a chance to discipline his own subordinate or start a war that would annihilate them both. A faint smile appeared on Antonio's lips, acknowledging Raphael's boldness, so different from the youth he recalled. Raphael's reply was quiet. He was younger then, with significantly less to defend. Raphael's gaze briefly met Elena's, a silent confirmation of his reordered priorities. Antonio capitulated and rose, declaring he would confront Marco. He disguised his concession with conditional language, promising a familial audit if the evidence was valid, a euphemism for internal sanctions, frequently lethal. Raphael's acceptance was a quiet vow of complete retaliation should this armistice be broken. With a somber nod and a request for 48 hours, Antonio and his men departed. Vincent appeared from a concealed observation room and stated the obvious. Antonio was fully aware. Raphael concurred, understanding that even a patriarch recognizes when the price of conflict becomes prohibitive. The strategic objective evolved from threat neutralization to narrative dominance. Marco was to be neutralized, his operational capacity systematically dismantled to mitigate immediate risk. However, the variable of Danny Mori remained unresolved. Elena identified Antonio's social capital as a strategic asset. By exposing Caleb's machinations against Michael, their response could be positioned as righteous enforcement, not strategic withdrawal. It was, as Raphael observed, a battle of public perception. A sequence of calculated measures commenced. Legal counsel fabricated incriminating documentation of Caleb's treachery. Vincent disseminated the narrative to media contacts, while Catherine and Elena crafted its emotional fulcrum, a statement from the perspective of the dying, now vindicated Michael. The narrative ignited a media firestorm. Michael Morelli was presented as a tragic archetype, his reputation posthumously restored, a martyr consumed by a corrupted institution. Caleb Voss was exposed as a predator, leveraging human lives for professional advancement. 3 days later, Danny Morelli presented at Raphael's office. Elena, transferred from the safe house despite her compromised state, observed not the hardened enforcer from his dossier, but an individual eviscerated by grief and shame. He was a pawn in a larger conflict, his aggression expertly redirected by external actors. In the presence of Elena, Catherine, and Raphael, Danny's psychological defenses collapsed. The visual stimulus of Elena with her infant Sophia breached his conditioned attachment. He professed his lack of awareness, claiming no knowledge of the intent to target a pregnant subject, his bereavement for Michael having been manipulated by false intelligence. The they he identified were operatives of Marco Morelli, who had constructed a fiction that Raphael assisted Caleb in his brother's ruin. His actions were motivated by a perceived need for just retribution. Elena's voice, a clinical fusion of empathy and resolve, delivered the terminal diagnosis. Michael was dying with his name cleared, but with no time to experience that freedom. Danny processed the catastrophic outcome of his campaign. He had nearly orphaned a child based on a fabrication. His apology was visceral, unconditional. Elena perceived not a hostile agent, but a youth whose trauma had been weaponized. Marco, she informed him, had deployed him not as an associate, but as a disposable instrument. Confronted with this paradigm shift, Danny abandoned his vendetta. He requested no absolution, only a cessation of hostilities to be with his brother during his final phase. Following a protracted, weighted silence, Raphael issued a single affirmative gesture. This clemency came with a stark ultimatum. A third transgression would not be tolerated. Danny concurred, his final gaze directed at Sophia, a silent acknowledgement of the precipice from which he was withdrawing. His departure triggered a strategic debate. Vincent interpreted the act as a sign of weakness, an assessment Elena gently corrected, remarking that Vincent perceived threats in all ambiguous stimuli. She, like Raphael, had registered the authenticity of Danny's remorse. The cold calculus of their operations then yielded to the primal requirements of the new life among them as they returned to the secure location to Sophia's calls for maternal contact. We observe here a subject's complete psychological metamorphosis. A mere 3 weeks prior, Elena Voss was a captive, a linguistic asset in a non-consensual partnership. She is now identified as Elena Moretti, mother to Sophia and partner to the individual who initiated scorched earth tactics to secure her. She is a key figure in a system whose brutal protocols she is only now internalizing. This integration, however, does not induce anxiety, but rather a profound cognitive awakening. When Raphael finds her in a contemplative state, she articulates a new conviction. This is not a transient safe harbor, it is her permanent reality. An offer of egress is met with an absolute refusal. She verbalizes a demand to comprehend the entire apparatus, its command structure, key personnel, and unwritten codes. The tutelage from Catherine, she states, is no longer adequate. She rejects the classification of a protected asset, demanding instead a functional role within the organization. Her petition to be integrated, to be more than the catalyst for conflicts waged in her name, represents a fundamental challenge to the established order. Raphael's faint smile registers not surprise, but anticipation. He had been awaiting this precise developmental stage. He outlines a specific function, an intelligence analyst, a role requiring pattern recognition, diplomatic acumen, and the capacity for ruthless decision-making. He then elevates the proposition beyond mere employment, suggesting a comprehensive partnership in all ventures. For Elena, this signifies a deliberate entry into a high-power dynamic, a direct countermeasure to the state of helplessness she experienced under Caleb. It is an opportunity to construct a future with Raphael based on more than a shared survival imperative. She accepts, stipulating one condition. Her non-negotiable term was the preservation of Sophia's psychological innocence, a boundary established in a world devoid of them. Raphael's kiss ratified their new pact. As the city slept, a tectonic shift occurred in Chicago's underworld. A new female power figure, forged by trauma and refined by conflict, had assumed her position. Holding her child, Elena Moretti began to architect their future, finally integrated into an environment congruent with her transformed self. 3 months later, the evidence of her operational efficacy is manifest. In her office, she analyzes surveillance data with surgical intensity. In a bassinet adjacent, Sophia sleeps, a symbol of domesticity unaware of her mother's grim analysis. On the monitor, Thomas Berkeley, a trusted subordinate, is observed in a behavioral pattern that indicates his imminent termination. Estimated within 48 hours. Vincent, who initially expressed doubt, now awaits her conclusion, his respect cultivated over 3 months of her unerringly precise assessments. Elena's conviction is total as she replays the footage. The recurring meeting, the consistent female associate, the use of untraceable currency. It was a fatal equation of predictable human fallibility. Note his body orientation, a subconscious aversion to the camera's clinical observation, Reese, she remarks. A clandestine romantic involvement, possibly, Vincent suggests. Elena's analysis has already progressed to a more severe hypothesis. A viable theory: if his paramour were not an agent with the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division, a federal identification card is displayed on the screen. Agent Sarah Chen. Her specialization: the complex architecture of money laundering. Vincent emits a sharp expletive. What is the duration of this breach? 6 confirmed weeks. The potential for a longer timeline exists. Elena's fingers move across the keyboard, accessing financial records. Observe the pattern. Berkeley is exfiltrating funds via shell corporations. Minor amounts designed to bypass security flags, but the frequency indicates he's probing the system's structural integrity. Probing for what purpose? To identify vulnerabilities he can provide to the FBI, Elena states, pressing her fingers to her temples. Sophia had rejected sleep as a necessity at 4 a.m. He is constructing their case for them, Vincent. Element by element, he is feeding them the exact evidence required for an irrefutable indictment before they initiate their move. Raphael must be briefed. I am aware, but absolute certainty was a prerequisite. Elena's gaze remains on the static image of Thomas Berkeley, a man she had socialized with who had once gifted Sophia a toy elephant. He has been in Raphael's service for 15 years. The institutional fallout will be catastrophic. It is preferable to a federal penitentiary, Vincent counters, retrieving his phone. I will arrange a briefing for this evening. Can you assemble the full intelligence package? The dossier is already compiled. Elena indicates a thick file on her desk. Surveillance images, transaction logs, audio recordings from wiretaps. The entire betrayal is documented within. Vincent lifts it, his professional regard increasing as he reviews the contents. Your level of precision is remarkable. I will grant you that. A faint smile forms on Elena's lips. See, Catherine's instruction was to operate under the assumption that all subjects are deceptive until proven otherwise. A paranoid methodology, but effective. In our operational environment, paranoia is a survival mechanism, Vincent says, pausing at the door. For the record, your assessment was correct regarding Peter, regarding Danny. Raphael's decision to integrate you was sound. It was the nearest he had ever come to a commendation. A novel sensation of warmth registered in Elena's chest. Following his exit, she devotes an hour to constructing a chronological analysis so irrefutable that Raphael could find no room for alternative interpretations. She detests this phase, the distressing point at which a hypothesis solidifies into incriminating evidence, when betrayal transitions from an abstract concept to a situation demanding resolution. A vocalization from Sophia signals a need for sustenance. Elena lifts her, nursing the infant by the window as November's initial snowfall begins. The safe house, under a new layer of white, appears deceptively serene. Your mother is preparing to deconstruct a man's life, Elena murmurs to the child. Or, more accurately, he has already deconstructed it himself. I am merely the agent required to report the facts. Sophia remains impassive, feeding with small, gratified sounds. At 3 months of age, her personality traits are already emerging, determined, impatient, and possessing a core belief that she is the central axis of her universe. A direct parallel to her father, Elena muses with a smile. Raphael had approached paternity with the same relentless focus he applied to all objectives. He had mastered diapering with tactical precision, could differentiate Sophia's various cries, and had secured her nursery to the standards of a presidential command center. He remained, however, awkward during periods of low stimulation, the moments defined solely by holding their sleeping offspring. Elena would discover him observing Sophia's crib at 2 a.m, his gaze fixed, as if unable to process her physical reality. "She is not an apparition that will dematerialize," Elena had informed him on one occasion. "I am aware, but my thoughts revert to how close we came to her non-existence." Raphael's voice had been strained with residual trauma. If you had not secured that taxi, if you had failed to reach the hospital. "But I did. We are both present." Elena had guided him away from the crib, redirecting him from the cognitive precipice of hypothetical scenarios. "You cannot shield her from every potential threat, Raphael. She will experience physical abrasions, emotional trauma, and behavioral missteps. I can attempt to prevent it." Herein lay the central pathology. Raphael operated under the delusion that he could shape all realities to his will. Elena was internalizing that certain variables, infants, informants, the future, do not respond to command. At approximately 3 o'clock, Catherine entered the office bearing coffee and a distressed expression. Vincent indicated a significant discovery. "Thomas Berkeley has been communicating with the FBI. Elena states, repositioning Sophia onto her shoulder. "He has engaged with them for 6 weeks, possibly longer. He is providing intelligence on our financial architecture." Catherine accepts the file, her gaze assessing the documents with a cool, professional detachment. "This is irrefutable. What was your method of discovery?" "I was conducting a review of surveillance from the legitimate enterprises, seeking any anomalous behavior. I observed Berkeley frequenting a coffee establishment far outside his typical routine. From that point, I mapped his movements, applied facial recognition to his contact, and identified Agent Chen." Elena took the coffee with appreciation. Once the pattern was identified, the remaining data points aligned. "You are developing a proficiency for this. I was instructed by the best." Elena observed Sophia's eyelids descend, a state of perfect contentment in sleep. "Furthermore, I possess a powerful motivator. Any traitor within this family constitutes a direct threat to my daughter. It sharpens one's focus." Catherine simply observed her for a moment. "You have undergone a complete metamorphosis. 3 months prior, you were barely ambulatory. Now you are directing counterintelligence from a sofa. At that time, my objective was mere survival. Now I have a life to safeguard." Elena set her cup down. "A distinction exists. No one could dispute that. And you are managing it all with a resilience few could ever manifest." Catherine occupied the chair opposite her. "But I am compelled to ask if you are genuinely stable. You endured hell, underwent major surgery, and are now a new mother within the Mafia. That is a substantial psychological load." "I am functional, Catherine. Truly, I am fatigued. My body continues its recovery. And yes, I experience nightmares of being forced into that vehicle, but I am functional." Elena met her stare. "I am executing what is necessary so Sophia can mature in a secure environment. If that requires me to become more affectless, more paranoid, and to trust no one, then I accept it. Just ensure you do not lose your core self in the process. I will not. Raphael will not permit it." Elena offered a faint smirk. "He provides grounding when my logic becomes too dispassionate. and you are the one who grounds him when his aggression becomes too volatile. Catherine rose to her feet. That is a potent dynamic, a rarity in this existence. The final debriefing occurred in Raphael's study, a space Elena now perceived as a chamber for terminal judgments. Raphael stood behind his desk, with Vincent and Marcus at his sides. Elena was seated opposite him, the file between them serving as a tangible indictment. Present the full analysis, Raphael commanded. And so, Elena systematically deconstructed the man's life. The surveillance captures, the compromised financials, the connection to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She maintained a clinical tone, a detached instrument relaying only cold data. Raphael's expression was impassive, but his knuckles were blanched where he gripped the desk. When she concluded, the sole sound was an old clock ticking on a shelf. 15 years. Raphael's voice was almost inaudible. He was my chief subordinate for 15 years. I provided him with everything, my entire infrastructure. I am aware. Elena suppressed the urge to reach for him, to provide comfort, but the context was inappropriate. This was operational. My apologies. Do not be. You performed your function. Raphael stood and moved to the window. Marcus, bring him to this location tonight. I require him to state it to my face. Boss, if he is collaborating with the feds, he has already disclosed all critical information. Apprehending him now will not alter the outcome. Raphael pivoted. But I have a psychological need to observe his expression as he attempts to rationalize the betrayal. They delivered Thomas Berkeley to the safe house near midnight. He offered no resistance, likely assuming it was a standard summons, oblivious to the increased guard detail or Marcus's close proximity. Elena observed from her office monitor, holding a sleeping Sophia. She had requested to be present, but Raphael had denied it. I will see this to its conclusion, he had stated. You completed the difficult analysis. I will complete the procedure. In the profound silence of the study, Berkeley appeared unsettled. The subject was 63, with silver hair, the archetype of a respectable banker in another reality. Raphael, what is the meaning of this? His voice was stable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of profound terror. It's late. You roused me from my bed. Raphael's tone was glacial. Were you in bed 6 weeks ago during your meeting with FBI agent Sarah Chen, or 2 weeks ago when you transferred our ledgers to her? The coloration drained from Berkeley's face. I have no knowledge of what you are referencing. A photograph slid across the desk. Berkeley and Chen in a cafe, their meeting documented. Attempt another response. A tremor passed through Berkeley's hand as his fingers enveloped the photograph. The silence expanded, taut and oppressive, before his voice fractured it. What is the source of this? Is that relevant? I suppose it is not. Berkeley placed the image down, flinching as if from a serpent. Do you intend to terminate me? That is contingent upon the why. Raphael leaned back into his chair. 15 years, Thomas. A decade and a half of loyalty, of mutual trust. What was the catalyst? My son. The name was fragile on Berkeley's lips. David? He encountered trouble. Narcotics, a negative peer group. The feds had him cornered. 20 years, they projected. His eyes were imploring. They presented me with an alternative. I provide them intelligence. David is released. I could not allow my son to atrophy in a cell for 2 decades, Raphael. I could not. A constrictive sensation formed in Elena's own chest. It was a repeated narrative of a father trapped, presented with a choice that had no correct solution. The resonance of the situation felt disturbingly familiar. So, you compromised us to save your offspring. I gave them financial records, Berkeley pleaded, his voice thin with anxiety. No tactical information, nothing that could result in physical harm. Only numbers, accounts. A paper trail, I reasoned. I thought I could offer just enough to satisfy the deal without precipitating genuine damage. Your reasoning was catastrophically flawed. Raphael's tone was without mercy. Those documents link to our legitimate operations, the politicians we control, the employment across 3 states. You did not give them numbers, Thomas. You gave them a schematic to incinerate everything we have constructed. I perceive that now. God, I am profoundly sorry. His composure disintegrated, and years of stress and guilt erupted from him. I perceived no other course of action. Raphael stood, pacing behind the desk like a confined predator. You should have come to me, informed me about David. For an associate loyal for 15 years, I would have made his problem cease to exist. My judgment was impaired. No, you experienced a panic response. You made a decision that will have devastating consequences for all of us. Raphael's anger had subsided into a deep, painful melancholy. The feds possess your file. When their case is fully developed, good people will be implicated, people who trusted you. What is your intention? The silence that followed was extended and damning. Observing the monitor, Elena suspended her breathing. You are going to rectify this, Raphael stated at last. You will return to Agent Chen and inform her the guilt is consuming you. Then you will feed her the exact narrative I provide. Berkeley's gaze rose, his expression a conflict of emergent hope and utter dread. You want me to function as a double agent? I want you to reverse the damage you have caused, or at a minimum, attempt to, Raphael said, perching on the edge of his desk. You will disseminate false intelligence, dispatch them on futile investigations, and secure us time to relocate our assets. Do this, and your son might avoid incarceration. And my response if I decline? In that event, I provide Agent Chen with an alternate file. The truth of David's actual activities, far more severe than his present legal issues, sufficient to imprison him for life. Raphael's smile was devoid of warmth. The decision is yours, Thomas. Serve me and protect your son, or forfeit everything. It was not a choice, but a sentencing. Berkeley understood this. Raphael understood this. And miles distant, Elena understood it as well. Very well, Berkeley acquiesced, defeated. I will do it. For the subsequent 2 hours, they constructed a complex web of disinformation for the FBI as Vincent dictated the falsehoods and their intended effects. Marcus transcribed every word, generating a script from which Berkeley was forbidden to deviate. Near 2 a.m., Elena placed Sophia in her crib, her arms sore from holding the infant. Returning to the office, she discovered Raphael viewing the recording of Berkeley's departure. You managed that with more restraint than I would have, Elena remarked, positioning herself on his lap. You would have simply had him terminated. The option was considered. She rested her head on his shoulder. He betrayed you for his son. I comprehend that impulse now. I would reduce the world to cinders for Sophia. I am aware, as would I. Raphael's embrace tightened. That is what makes this so complex. I cannot genuinely despise him, because I understand his rationale. but such an act cannot be left without consequence. No, in their subculture, weakness was a terminal condition. He felt completely depleted. If my subordinates believe they can betray me without consequence, the entire structure collapses. Thomas was required to serve as an object lesson. And if the feds expose his deception, he and his son receive lengthy sentences, and our strategic position is not worsened. Raphael assisted Elena to her feet. Come, it is late. You have not had more than 4 hours of uninterrupted sleep in 3 months. As they crossed into the bedroom, Raphael's phone vibrated. He examined the message, his brow furrowing, then dispatched a reply. What is it? Antonio Morelli requests a meeting tomorrow morning at his location. Raphael set the phone down. He states it is a matter of urgency. A somatic stress response manifested in Elena, who correctly identified Marco as the source. She profiled him as an unstable element, stating, Antonio tries to control that boy, but he's a loose cannon. Raphael attempted de-escalation by compartmentalizing their roles. The next day began with routine parental duties before their associate, Catherine, presented new intelligence. The data showed Marco Morelli at a South Side site with 15 armed individuals. A clear display of force in a disputed area. It's a power projection, Raphael assessed from the photographs. That site's been contested for months. Marco is attempting to establish a fourth claim. An operative named Vincent reported that street-level intelligence indicated Marco was consolidating smaller, dissident crews. Elena clinically assessed the potential threat level, asking how many would actually stand with him. It's hard to tell. Could be 50, could be more. Vincent responded. Antonio wants this meeting to contain it, he added, framing the patriarch's motive as preemptive damage control. The meeting was set for a warehouse in Bridgeport. Raphael's insistence that Elena remain secured was an anticipated, protective response. Her counter-proposal was not. I want a live audio feed, Elena stipulated, her tone indicating non-negotiable terms. If things go sideways, I need to know instantly. She framed her demand around the imperative of securing their child, Sophia. Raphael's initial resistance was overridden by Catherine's logical affirmation. She's right. If a war is breaking out, we need the first possible warning. Indeed, the transmission was established in Elena's office, where she and Catherine monitored the audio feed while the infant slept, noting the sounds of the vehicle, the warehouse door, and Antonio's initial greeting. Antonio's vocal tonality suggested acute distress. We have an issue, he began. It's about Marco and his new friends. He admitted his grandson had established alliances against his express prohibition with the Vulov organization. This information elicited a startled response from both Elena and Catherine, who knew the Vulov's profile for extreme violence. Marco's action represented a strategic escalation. Raphael's query, how deep is he in, was delivered with clinical detachment. The infiltration was severe, involving weapons trafficking and profit-sharing agreements contingent on seizing Raphael's assets. I tried to reason with him. I cut him off. Antonio recounted his failed interventions. Raphael's diagnosis was blunt. Then you must do the thing you should have done 3 months ago. Antonio vocalized his conflict over eliminating his grandson, stating, He is my blood. Raphael countered the emotional plea with cold logic. And you will, if you want to stop a war. Marco made his choice. He chose the Vulovs over you. Following a prolonged silence, Antonio verbalized his inability to act. I can't kill my own blood. Raphael's reply was a declaration of intent. Then I will. But be perfectly clear, Antonio. If I handle Marco, it will be a public statement. The patriarch's plea was a last-ditch effort. Give me one last chance. Raphael established a clear ultimatum. You have 24 hours. After that, Marco becomes my problem. His parting words served as a final warning against interference. The feed terminated. Elena processed the converging threats, the Vulovs, Marco's insurgency, and Antonio's emotional paralysis, recognizing the formula for imminent, catastrophic conflict. This entire affair is a breath away from exploding, Catherine clinically observed. Antonio won't kill Marco, he'll hide him. Elena's cognitive process was already engaged, seeking the necessary leverage to force Antonio to choose self-preservation over familial attachment. The key vulnerability was identified: Marco's alliance with the Vulovs. If we prove he's not just taking turf, but selling out all of Chicago's families to the Russians, Antonio has to act. His own code will demand it. So Catherine correctly labeled the strategy. You want to frame Marco as a traitor. My intent is to create a scenario where Antonio cannot shelter him without ensuring his own destruction, Elena clarified. She began coordinating intelligence assets via her keyboard. The Vulovs are running weapons through his territory. That leaves a digital footprint. Her plan was to weaponize this information, forcing Antonio to either disown Marco or forfeit his standing. Catherine's assessment was accurate. That is both ingenious and exceptionally vicious. It's what the moment demands, Elena replied, already tasking Vincent with acquiring port intel on the next Vulov shipment. They spent the subsequent 6 hours preparing the psychological weapon. Vincent's port contact confirmed a weapons delivery was scheduled within 2 days, while Catherine's team observed Marco's crew preparing a receiving warehouse. Elena synthesized the intelligence into a cohesive, irrefutable file demonstrating Marco had provided the Vulovs a strategic entry into Chicago's underworld. Upon Raphael's return, she presented the documented betrayal. There is a more refined method than simply killing Marco, she stated, outlining a strategy of psychological warfare. Raphael's expression shifted from surprise to grim comprehension. You intend to ruin him without us lifting a finger. My intention is for Antonio to have no alternative but to do it himself. Elena presented the dossier as a strategic maneuver in a data-driven conflict. Marco has committed the one unforgivable act. Leaking this forces Antonio's decision. He either responds or his power crumbles. If he hesitates, this file goes to every other family. Her gaze was unwavering. Marco's fate is already decided. We are merely selecting the executioner. Raphael absorbed the documentation before soliciting Vincent's opinion. Your wife has a more lethal strategic mind than most men I've known, Vincent observed, and I offer that as the highest compliment. It's surgical, Marcus noted from the doorway. My way is usually more direct, but I admire the craft. Raphael refocused his attention on Elena, observing, You've been in this world for only 3 months, yet you're planning a campaign 10 steps ahead. I had a very capable teacher and an overwhelming reason, she responded, her affect softening as she looked at Sophia. I promised you I would be an asset. A genuine laugh escaped Raphael. Elena, you are no mere asset. You've become the entire strategic core of this family. He embraced her, then affirmed, We will execute this exactly as you've designed. Vincent organized a summit with the heads of the other families. reasoning they need to see the raw facts before Antonio has a chance to spin his own story. In a secure chamber, leaders from 5 families convened, their shared anxiety about the Volkoffs' encroachment palpable. Raphael presented Elena's file as empirical evidence, photographic records of Marco with Volkov operatives, decrypted communications detailing a weapons contract, and manifests confirming a permanent logistics channel facilitated by Marco. The room devolved into a state of agitated chaos as old loyalties fractured under the weight of the new data. The syndicate's consensus was reached by morning. Marco Moretti was a systemic threat requiring immediate neutralization. Raphael's exclusion of Antonio was a calculated psychological tactic, ensuring the patriarch would learn of the verdict from his peers. The subsequent call from Antonio confirmed the strategy's success. His voice was hollowed. "You have completely annihilated him." "No," Raphael replied, his tone flat. "Marco did this to himself. I simply brought his deeds into the light. The families are demanding justice." "I am aware," Antonio conceded, his laugh laced with bitterness. "You have won on every front. Marco is gone, the Volkovs are pushed back, and you emerge with not a speck of blood on you." Raphael's communication with the patriarch was a clinical formality. "I warned you to get your grandson on a leash. You didn't, so I had to." He employed a feigned expression of regret. "This gives me no pleasure," which Antonio correctly identified as disingenuous with a rasped "liar." The matter was concluded. Marco's termination was scheduled within 48 hours. Ending the call, Raphael turned to Elena, inquiring about her psychological state after orchestrating a subject's death warrant. A different individual might have exhibited signs of moral distress. She, in contrast, presented a study in dissociative calm. Her statement was clinical. "I feel like I've secured our future. Nothing further." Marco was an unstable element threatening citywide conflict. That variable has been neutralized. The case is closed. Raphael exhibited a mild startle response. "And you're at ease with this?" "I am at ease with Sophia's safety," she corrected. "And if ensuring it requires the removal of any subject who poses a threat, then I have reached a state of resolution." Her affect was flat, her gaze fixed. "Does that classify me as a monster?" He responded, "It classifies you as a survivor. It classifies you as a queen." He embraced her, expressing profound admiration. "I assessed you as brilliant, but this is a higher order function." "I had an effective teacher," she said, "and my conditioning is incomplete." "That it will be, host," he affirmed. Raphael's assessment labeled her his brilliant, ruthless partner. Then, as if on cue, the infant Sophia began to vocalize distress. Elena retrieved the child, inhaling the scent of a baseline innocent. "Mama terminated a conflict for you today," she murmured. "Mama mitigated a direct threat to your well-being." The infant's stimulus, however, was merely nutritional deficit. As Elena pacified her, the first snowflakes of winter commenced their descent. 3 months prior, she had been a trauma case. Now she operated on a separate cognitive plane, more detached and powerful than she had ever conceived of. The personality construct that had collapsed in that hospital, fragmented and threat-responsive, would be unrecognizable to her current self. That former iteration lacked the adaptive traits to survive this environment. It could not have protected Sophia, nor could it have functioned as Raphael's equal rather than his liability. Observing her daughter, Elena Moretti formed a silent protocol. Never again. She would acquire every dark methodology required for success in this system, and any entity threatening her family unit would learn the clinical definition of a mother's aggression. The Chicago Syndicate had just integrated its newest, most effective operator. 3 days post-event, Marco Morelli's body was retrieved from the river, his feet set in concrete. The media reported a gang-related homicide. The families classified it as a settled debt. Elena simply classified it as concluded. Raphael presented the morning paper as she fed Sophia. Antonio performed the act himself, he reported, his expression neutral. Vincent's assets confirmed it. No outsourcing. He terminated his own grandson. Elena adjusted the infant, processing the severe psychological weight of such an action. What is his condition? Compromised. Vincent reports he's aged a decade in 3 days. Raphael seated himself beside her. He is transferring operational control to his nephew, maintaining a purely symbolic title. As a result of Marco, as a result of prioritizing a blood relation over the organization, nearly triggering systemic collapse, he is now self-administering punishment. A trace of empathy was detectable in Raphael's voice. This marks the end of an era. Antonio Morelli controlled the South Side for 40 years. Now he is just a traumatized old man. Yelena observed her own neurologically perfect daughter, unable to compute that kind of choice. Her offspring versus her empire. The very concept induced a visceral negative response. That will not be our outcome, she stated softly. I will not be placed in a scenario where I must choose between Sophia and our enterprise 2 decades from now. Then we must construct a different system, Raphael replied. A foundation where she is not indoctrinated into this life by default. He disclosed his own ideation about an exit strategy, a method to accumulate sufficient legitimate power that they could disengage entirely. Is that a viable possibility? She inquired. Unknown. But the attempt is mandatory, he said. For her, for us. I will not permit Sophia to mature believing this is the only reality. And that hypothesis began to take root in Elena's mind. She had developed a frightening aptitude for this life, the necessary brutality, the strategic calculations, the entire methodology. But she would never allow this environment to become her baseline. She refused to raise Sophia within a perimeter of armed guards and armored fortifications. Thus began her own covert operation, researching the histories of criminal dynasties that had successfully transitioned to legitimacy. It was a high-risk endeavor, attempting to sanitize assets so deeply stained with violence, but it was an initial step. Catherine discovered her late one night, surrounded by texts on corporate law. What is the purpose of this? She asked. An exit vector for Raphael, a clean slate for Sophia. Elena's fingers applied pressure to her temples. I am attempting to structure the first phase. Catherine's gaze swept the documents. This is not a phase. This is a complete rewrite of the narrative. I am building a parallel structure, Elena clarified, tracing a data point on a spreadsheet. Legitimate businesses, verifiable profits, engineered to exsanguinate the illicit one. And the personnel from the original operation, Catherine countered. The question remained in the space between them, the primary anomaly in Elena's projections. We migrate them, Elena stated, her tone steady. Assign them functions in the legitimate ventures, reskill them, and provide an off-ramp for any who choose to take it. Her gaze met Catherine's. I grasp the complexity, but our current system is unstable. A single human error, one dedicated federal agent, and the entire construct disintegrates. It is preferable we dismantle it under our own control. And you assess this as achievable? For Sophia, Elena affirmed, no other outcome is acceptable. Elena monitored the gentle rhythm of her daughter's respiration. I refuse to let her internalize a worldview where strength is a weapon and affection is a vulnerability. A long silence ensued before Catherine's lips formed a smile. You might actually execute this. You have the cognitive ability for it and the requisite audacity. I cannot do it in isolation. You will not have to. State your requirements. Catherine moved a chair forward. Very well. Let us begin to map the trajectory. They worked until dawn, drafting the framework of a years-long extraction that offered a remote probability of success. It was a plan predicated on audacity, bordering on the statistically improbable. Yet for Elena, the impossible was simply a problem set awaiting a solution. The first structural failure came from an unmonitored variable. For 2 months, their asset, Thomas Berkeley, had been generating a stream of false intelligence for the FBI, a strategic misdirection while Raphael's network contracted. The ruse was flawless until a single error. Berkeley named a property that did not exist in their fabricated reality. Agent Sarah Chen identified the inconsistency instantly. In 24 hours, the Bureau knew he was a hostile agent. In 48, they had him in custody. Vincent's report landed with the force of a psychological blow. The Federals have Berkeley. He is already cooperating. Not about us at present, but he has compromised the entire diversion. A muscle in Raphael's jaw tensed. Assess the damage. Difficult to quantify. The misdirection bought us time. Our key personnel are secure, but Berkeley holds data that can compromise us, and they will leverage his son to ensure his cooperation. I'm aware, Raphael said, his posture agitated. What is our file on this Agent Chen? No actionable intelligence. She is incorruptible, and now she is highly motivated by our deception, Vincent reported. However, Vincent offered, there is a secondary approach. It involves Berkeley's son, David, the catalyst for this crisis. A cold dread began to form in Elena's stomach. What is the proposal? He's in a transitional housing facility, per his father's plea agreement. If David were to experience a relapse and violate his parole, the agreement becomes null. Berkeley loses his leverage, and the FBI's case collapses. Elena's voice was devoid of inflection. And you would sabotage a young man to control his father? I would engineer a scenario, Vincent corrected precisely, where Berkeley must make a new decision. David need not be harmed. We simply apply enough pressure to ensure he recidivates. The option of removing the son as a factor remained on the table. The young man's prior choices had already destabilized his father and created a systemic threat. There was a cruel logic in allowing events to run their course. Vincent looked to Raphael. It was the optimal solution, neutralizing the threat from Berkeley without increasing the body count. Raphael was still, his expression unreadable as he calculated the brutal mathematics of their world. No, he said at last. Vincent appeared surprised. Boss, I said no. David is not a variable in this equation. The directive was final. Berkeley created his own consequences, as did his son. We do not prevail by creating orphans. The moment we target David, we signal to our people that their own children are mere assets. That is a boundary I will not cross. Our countermove on Berkeley, complete neutralization of his value, every asset he accessed, every ledger he viewed, every covert route he knew. We will erase it and rebuild. We render his knowledge obsolete. Raphael then turned to Elena. Your assessment. Unsurprised and prepared, she replied immediately. Vincent's proposal is a short-term solution with catastrophic long-term liabilities. We would purchase current security with future loyalty. Our operatives must believe their families are sacrosanct, even in the case of betrayal. If we violate that protocol, we become the monsters they serve, and allegiance built on fear is not allegiance at all. Elena held his gaze. We are required to be better than that. For Sophia, if not for ourselves. Raphael gave a slow, deliberate nod. Agreed. We proceed with Elena's strategy. Vincent, initiate the protocol. I want everything Berkeley knew expunged and reconstructed in 72 hours. Vincent seemed poised to object, but instead gave a sharp nod and departed to execute the order. Elena waited until they were alone. Thank you for not targeting David. That was not for your benefit. It was because your analysis was without flaw. Raphael drew her closer. You cannot construct a new reality from the damaged components of the old one. At times, restraint demonstrates more power than attack. Catherine would label that a weakness. Catherine constructed a fortress to survive, but she is now a prisoner within it, capable of trusting no one. Raphael's vocalizations shifted to a softer register, a clinical tactic to imply sincerity. I will not permit that outcome for us or for Sophia. My objective is for her to perceive family as a sanctuary, where loyalty is not merely a mechanism for avoiding harm. It was his most unguarded state she had observed in some time. Without Berkeley's testimony, the state's case collapsed. Agent Chen's subsequent efforts were exercises in futility. After 3 months, the investigation was quietly terminated. Thomas Berkeley served 18 months for his offenses. His son David completed his education and assumed a life of anonymity. Elena would later learn Berkeley sent a single letter from incarceration. It contained 5 words. Thank you for my son. Raphael offered no reply. None was indicated. His silence functioned as the required assent. By the time Sophia reached 1 year of age, Elena had engineered a complete 5-year protocol to convert 60% of Raphael's holdings into legitimate enterprises. The strategy was a high-risk variable contingent on the absolute compliance of his primary subordinates. The meeting was held in a sterile boardroom, an environment of investment banking that created a jarring cognitive dissonance. Vincent, Marcus, Catherine, and 5 other capos observed as Elena presented her strategic framework with Sophia resting in a cradle nearby. This is not an instantaneous event, Elena clarified, guiding them through a matrix of financial data. This is a controlled de-escalation, a gradual pivot designed to secure all of your futures with clean, consistent income. And the disposition of those who refuse to adapt? Marcus interjected. We have personnel who are predators, not financiers. It is their only known function. They will remain with the legacy operations until the enterprise becomes non-viable or external pressures intensify. No asset will be abandoned, Elena affirmed, gesturing to a final data set. But we make the new paradigm the superior option. Increased compensation, tangible benefits, a pension, medical, a life with actual viability. Vincent's analysis fixated on the numbers, the sheer capital required to manifest this new reality. From where is this level of funding sourced? He questioned. It would be generated by divesting from their former operations, gambling, low-level narcotics, protection schemes, every high-profile, violent business that attracted law enforcement. Elena's expression was unyielding. We pivot to low-visibility operations, laundering capital through flawless shell companies, high-tier consulting, acquiring key corporate assets, enterprises that appear legitimate because we will engineer them to be. So, our new function is banking, Vincent stated, his tone a mix of disbelief and fascination. We become the facade we always maintained, Elena replied, entrepreneurs with a complex operational history. Her final slide appeared. In 5 years, Rafael Moretti's influence would be absolute, built upon an unassailable legal structure. His progeny would be granted a legacy beyond the reach of the law and impervious to their adversaries. It was the terminal phase of the operation. A heavy silence filled the room as each individual contemplated the implications for their own survival. Catherine was the first to speak. I am in alignment. I have been seeking an exit strategy for a long time. This is the first one with a credible chance of success. Marcus was next. I concur. I am aging out of this type of conflict. I can learn to wear a suit for a purpose other than concealing a weapon. The consensus spread through the room. Vincent, the last to verbalize, was still processing the risk. 5 years is a significant duration. There are 1,000 ways for this to fail. And one way for it to succeed, Elena countered. This course has no guarantees, but our present trajectory is a confirmed terminal event. Vincent's gaze shifted to Raphael, who had been a silent, imposing presence. What is the directive, boss? I assess, Raphael said, his voice low as he moved to stand beside Elena, that my wife has just charted a future that warrants any cost. Only a fool would reject it. Wife? The word was a final judgment, a verdict in a charged atmosphere, not his partner, not his asset. Elena glanced at her bare hand as Raphael's fingers laced with hers. It will be formalized shortly, he murmured, when the variables stabilize. But their world was a perpetual crisis. Now, however, the crisis was one of controlled deconstruction. In the following months, the strategy was executed with a chilling, flawless precision. Their legitimate businesses began to operate, circulating clean, taxable revenue and building a public profile, a brand, and real influence. The transition was not without casualties. 2 associates, psychologically incapable of adapting, were given severance packages and removed from the equation. A real estate speculation failed, costing them a painful $3 million lesson. Agent Sarah Chen monitored their new corporations like a predator, sensing the ghost of a criminal organization beneath the polished facade. But the primary gambit was, in large part, succeeding. 1 year into this reinvention, Raphael made his proposal, not over wine, but at 3 a.m, after Sophia's acute distress had finally subsided into exhausted sleep. Marry me, he breathed, collapsing back into their bed. She was so deep in fatigue, she processed it as a dream. What did you say? Marry me. Officially with legal force and permanence, I require you to be my wife in every sense the world recognizes. Pushing himself up on one elbow, Raphael faced her in the dark. I know we are functionally. We share a domicile, a daughter, an empire. But I want the contract. I want Sophia to know her parents are a single entity, not 2 individuals cohabiting for convenience. Elena searched his face, a terrain of shadows. You are serious about this? Absolutely, I should have initiated this a year ago, but there was always a new crisis to manage. Tonight, however, listening to our daughter's cries while you soothed her, despite your own physical exhaustion, I realized what a fool I've been to delay. You are my wife in every way that holds genuine substance. Let us simply make it official. That has to be the single least romantic proposal ever articulated. A trace of a smile touched his lips. I know, I am inept at this. But I love you, Elena. I have loved you since you walked into my office 3 years ago to dissect my Russian accent. I loved you while you were hemorrhaging on a hospital bed. I loved you the moment you neutralized Thomas Berkeley. And I love you right now, exhausted and marked by our child's saliva. You are the most formidable woman I have ever encountered. Tears tracked silently down her face. You are showing improvement. Is that a yes? It is a yes. Their kiss was the confirmation of the contract. Elena required a ritual, not a rushed event, but a true ceremony to sanctify their new family's survival. Raphael's sole stipulation was her word. 3 months later, they were married before their functional family, the one forged in the crucible of 2 chaotic years. Catherine stood with Elena, Vincent and Marcus with Raphael, Sophia, at 16 months old and possessing her father's solemnity, distributed petals down the aisle with intense concentration. A gift was delivered from Antonio Morelli, the card bearing a sharp, insightful inscription, "Congratulations on finally possessing something to lose." His non-attendance was a given. A man defined by the damage he inflicted on his grandson's life had no place at a wedding. The true specter was Danny Morelli, whose sudden appearance at the reception caused Marcus's hand to move, an action halted by Raphael's glance. I am not here for conflict, Danny said, his hands raised, palms visible. I came to offer best wishes and to say thank you. For what? Elena asked, her voice neutral. Michael died last month. He had 6 peaceful months. He was a free man, his reputation restored, knowing his sacrifice was not meaningless. Danny's voice was thick with emotion. You did not have to do that. You could have simply eliminated me and concluded the matter. You restored my brother's honor before he expired. For that, I am in your debt. With that, he receded back into the city's absorbing darkness. As he disappeared, Raphael drew Elena close, acknowledging her unique miracle. She had discovered a third option, a path devoid of casualties where none should have been possible. I saved all of us from our enemies and from ourselves, she corrected. My talent is perceiving exits where everyone else sees a solid barrier. Whoa, one of your many talents, Raphael agreed, placing a kiss on her temple. Dance with me, Mrs. Moretti. They moved as one, while Catherine watched Sophia as the syndicate that nearly destroyed them began its slow transformation into a legacy their daughter would never need to feel shame for. 2 years forward, Elena stands before a boardroom table in a glass tower. Her audience is not comprised of soldiers, but of industry leaders. The Moretti Group was going public, its real estate and consulting divisions being offered to the world. This was the final, non-negotiable pivot. If the market responded favorably, the last shadow of their past would be incinerated by public legitimacy. Her presentation was flawless. She had lived and breathed the data for months, anticipating every query with responses that were both accurate and elegantly evasive. By the time she concluded, 3 of the investors were already signaling for their contracts. At the back of the room, Raphael watched, with Sophia positioned on his hip. She was almost 4, a bright, energetic girl, wholly ignorant of the savage world her parents had first engineered and then dismantled solely for her. Later, they moved through Chicago as a family unit, not a syndicate, just a mother and father purchasing their daughter an ice cream cone, claiming a fragment of the ordinary life that had once been an impossible scenario. "We actually did it," Raphael murmured, observing Sophia run toward the playground. 5 years. We executed the plan. Not completely. The old apparatus still functions, still generates profit, Elena reminded him, her gaze fixed on their child. The remaining liabilities are now of a manageable scale, allowing for surgical removal without systemic collapse. What is the projected timeline for complete sanitation? Approximately 1 year, possibly 2. Illicit gaming assets will be divested to other syndicates. Financial laundering becomes redundant once all capital is legitimate. Elena initiated physical contact, a gesture of reliance. By Sophia's first year of formal education, our assumed identities will become our reality. And the subsequent phase? Then we normalize. We raise the child, expand the enterprise, and establish a true dynasty. The subject smiled. A second child is a possibility if you feel sufficiently stabilized. Raphael exhibited a mild laugh response. The current one is already a significant stressor. Reevaluate my state in 1 year. A period of shared, nonverbal observation ensued as they monitored their daughter's play with peers unaware of her lineage. "Do you experience remorse?" Raphael inquired after a pause. "For your past actions? For the persona you were forced to adopt?" Elena processed the query, her mind accessing memories of the inciting trauma, a terrified subject collapsing on a hospital floor. The primal desperation compelling her to call his name, every calculated, a moral decision that led to this moment of calm. "No," she concluded. "Those actions were a function of survival for myself, for Sophia, for our unit." She made eye contact with him. "I derive no pride from my methods, but I feel no shame in them." "We achieved our objective, Raphael. Within a system designed for our fragmentation, we maintained cohesion and built a legitimate structure from the chaos. This is the primary outcome." Elena's focus shifted to Sophia on a slide, her laughter an auditory signal of uncomplicated contentment. "Observe her. She is content. She is secure. She has no experiential knowledge of fear. This is the outcome we provide. It justifies every morally ambiguous act we committed." Raphael engaged in a physical embrace. "I value you, Elena Moretti, for your intellect, your resilience, your profound capacity for creating order from ruin. And I value you for perceiving my potential beyond a traumatized state, for arming me instead of allowing my psyche to shatter." Elena initiated a kiss. "The 3 of us will maintain stability." And for the first time in an extended period, they did. The Moretti conglomerate continued its upward trajectory, diversifying into legitimate sectors and accumulating lawful capital. The criminal infrastructure was systematically deconstructed over 18 painstaking months. Hostilities with rival factions were concluded via asset transfers, a substantial price for cessation, and a clean operational record. By the time Sophia reached age 5, all historical liabilities were considered neutralized. Raphael and Elena established themselves within Chicago's social elite. They engaged in philanthropy, founding an organization to facilitate others' exits from the criminal underworld. It was a calculated performance, but one informed by authentic experience. They understood the psychology of that world and felt a responsibility to provide an escape vector. Catherine, always the sentinel, was appointed head of security, redirecting her hypervigilance toward corporate counterintelligence. Vincent, a specialist in illicit finance, was named chief financial officer, his acumen now focused on growth rather than concealment. Marcus received a substantial severance package and relocated to Florida, capitalized for several lifetimes of inactivity. Thomas Berkeley was released from custody and ceased to be a trackable entity. Intelligence indicated he was operating a small business in Oregon with his son. Elena initiated a single, untraceable fund transfer. Upon discovering this, Raphael gestured with an eyebrow but remained silent. It was her conviction that all individuals merit an opportunity to reset. "What is our policy on those who betray us?" he inquired. "Is forgiveness the lesson we impart to Sophia?" "I am teaching her that mercy is not synonymous with weakness, that true strength lies in the freedom of choice," she retorted. "At times, the greatest demonstration of power is to withhold annihilation of an enemy you could easily destroy." A slight smile formed on Elena's lips. Berkeley is, in any case, already compromised. His paranoid pathology cost him everything. He inhabits a psychological prison he constructed himself. Antonio Morelli expired from natural causes 2 years after Marco's death. The funeral was a minimalist event, its attendees relics of his former status. Raphael was present, paid his respects, and departed, bearing the symbolic weight of a concluded era. He was a decent man once, Raphael reflected that evening, prior to Marco, prior to the betrayals, before the systemic collapse. He was my primary mentor in this environment. "The very dynamics that dismantled him could dismantle us," Elena responded in a low tone. "If we permit it, if we prioritize power over allegiance, if we allow ambition to pathologize us." "It will not," Raphael affirmed, drawing her closer, "because you function as our moral anchor, reminding us of our core values." "I am not immune to error." "No," he acknowledged, touching his lips to her forehead. "But you possess the self-awareness to know it. That is the critical variable." On Sophia's 7th birthday, an antagonist from their past, Agent Sarah Chen, appeared at their residence, holding a file, her demeanor showing signs of fatigue. "Mrs. Moretti, I appreciate you consenting to this meeting." Chen occupied a seat in their main room, refusing a beverage. "I will be brief. For 5 years, my professional life has been dedicated to your family, in pursuit of a criminal organization I was convinced existed." "And what were your findings?" Elena's vocal tone was perfectly regulated. "I found an absence of evidence because the entity no longer exists. You have fully transitioned to a legitimate operation. Through..." Chen placed the folder on the table. "This is my concluding report. It determines that the Moretti family, despite the founders' backgrounds, now operates entirely within legal parameters." Elena did not look at the document. "What is your purpose in showing me this?" "It is to inform you that the investigation is officially closed. You have won." "You executed a perfect exit strategy," Chen remarked, her voice containing a mix of professional resentment and reluctant admiration. "But be advised, I will maintain peripheral surveillance. Any regression to your former behaviors, and I will intervene." "There will be no regression," Elena declared with firm resolve. We constructed this life for our daughter. We will not sacrifice it to past dynamics. Chen maintained eye contact for a prolonged, silent interval. The frustrating element is that I find your statement credible. The sincerity is palpable. She stood up. Congratulations, Mrs. Moretti. You have succeeded in becoming completely uninteresting. After her departure, Raphael emerged from the kitchen, where he had been a silent observer. Uninteresting? He echoed. We have become dull. We have become secure, Elena corrected, embracing him. And the distinction is vast. They provided Sophia with the precise birthday celebration she had envisioned. A dozen of her schoolmates were in attendance, with a large cake, numerous gifts, and a state of joyful, benign chaos. Elena observed her daughter extinguish the candles, her wish lost in the cheering, surrounded by peers who knew her only as Sophia, not as the scion of a criminal empire converted into a charitable foundation. Much later that night, with Sophia asleep and the residence quiet, Raphael and Elena sat outside, observing the stars. Do you believe she will ever require the information? Raphael asked, his voice low. About our past identities, our previous actions? Eventually, Elena replied, leaning against him. When she is mature enough to grasp moral ambiguity, human complexity, and difficult choices, but not for a very long time. Let her retain her innocence. At the appropriate time, we will provide a full disclosure. They had made extreme decisions to navigate an extreme environment. They had inflicted harm and destroyed lives in the service of self-preservation. Yet they had also attempted to construct a new reality from the remnants, to afford their daughter a range of choices they never possessed. Elena gazed at the night sky. They would teach her that individuals can alter their own narratives, given sufficient motivation. That redemption remains a possibility, even for those who perceive themselves as beyond it. Do you believe that? He inquired. That we have achieved redemption? Elena's thoughts returned to her former self, terrified, cornered, and expiring in a medical facility. She considered her present self a leader, a strategist, capable of both detached logic and profound mercy. She reviewed every decision that connected these two states, every act of violence and clemency, every reality they had deconstructed, and every life they had built. I believe we are in the process of trying, she said at last. And I suspect that is the entire objective. We are not the same individuals. They cannot erase their history, but they are creating a future in which Sophia will not be burdened by it. For me, that is the definition of success. Raphael was silent for a moment. Then he stated, I am profoundly glad I answered the phone that night from the hospital. I am glad I provided them with your number, she confessed, even with the knowledge of what it would trigger, what it would make you become. Perhaps that was the exact reason I did it. Elena turned to him. You asked if I regret my strategies. I do not, because each one led us to this specific outcome. To Sophia, asleep in her bed. To a life so normalized it borders on mundane. To a future where our daughter has unlimited potential because we secured it with our own trauma and secrecy. It was a joint construction. That it was, Elena affirmed and kissed him. And we will continue to build, continue to protect, and ensure this structure we have created does not ultimately crush the people we love. The years passed. Sophia developed into an intelligent, self-assured young woman, possessing her mother's strategic thinking and her father's acute instincts. She succeeded in elite educational environments, formed social bonds, and experienced the normative adolescence her parents had purchased with violence. On her 16th birthday, Elena determined the time was right. She disclosed everything. Not a sanitized account, but the raw, complete truth about Caleb's betrayal, the assassins dispatched for her, and Raphael's scorched earth campaign to ensure their survival. She recounted their operational decisions, antisocial acts justified as essential for survival and in-group protection. Sophia processed this disclosure in complete silence. The ensuing quiet was profound. A mobster, then, Sophia concluded. Correct, as was your father. I see, but that identity is past. Yes, Elena confirmed, maintaining eye contact. We are not. We transitioned the enterprise into a legitimate entity for you to provide choices we lacked, a future not predicated on coercion. Sophia processed this. Did you personally commit homicide? Not directly, but I issued directives that resulted in fatalities, as did your father. Elena's vocal tone was clinical. We do not endorse these actions, but we will not falsify the record. Given the same circumstances, would you repeat your actions? Elena reviewed the memories. A hemorrhaging subject, a premature infant in distress, and every instance where aggression was the sole viable tactic. I would replicate every action precisely, she stated without hesitation. Those choices led to your existence, a result for which I feel no regret. Sophia nodded with slow deliberation. Understood. It is a significant data point, but I comprehend. You acted to ensure my survival. A slight smile formed on her lips. The profile is actually quite formidable, my mother as a retired criminal strategist. The release of tension manifested as laughter in Elena. Is that my new professional designation? That is your designation, 100%. You should integrate it. Sophia initiated a tight embrace. My affection for you is unconditional. Perhaps it is amplified by this disclosure. Upon Raphael's return, Elena relayed the conversation verbatim. His primary fear was that Sophia would experience revulsion, viewing her parents as pathological figures. She termed me formidable, Elena reported, and indicated she comprehends the context despite the cognitive load. That is our daughter, Raphael exhaled, his physiological tension decreasing markedly. Intelligent, empathetic, and apparently undisturbed by having felons for parents. Rehabilitated felons, Elena offered as a soft correction. Is the distinction meaningful? We committed monstrous acts, Elena. We destroyed lives, terminated futures. We prioritized survival over ethical codes repeatedly. Raphael sat heavily on the couch. Is this tranquility something we are entitled to? He frequently questioned. Entitlement is not a relevant variable. We engineered this piece. We actualized it through strategy and force, refusing to be defined by our past. Elena's fingers made contact with his. We are not morally good individuals. That may be a permanent state, but we are attempting rehabilitation. Does that not have value? Can any attempt at restitution negate the scale of the damage we caused? She processed his query, visualizing the void left by Thomas Berkeley and Danny Morelli's brother. No, she replied, her voice soft but resolute. Nothing nullifies it, but the past is immutable. Our only course is constructing a better future, For Sophia, for all those within our sphere of influence. Her grasp on his hand tightened, serving as an anchor. This was the foundational principle of their new existence, the core driver of their operations, a persistent, urgent attempt to balance their moral ledger, despite knowing equilibrium was unattainable. Failure would only intensify their efforts. Regression was not an option. The cost had been too high to concede. Elena drew him into an embrace. We will secure our peace, Raphael, all of us. We will witness Sophia's achievements, possibly our descendants, and understand that our fractured human state was sufficient. The Moretti Foundation became a key institution in Chicago, providing resources and exit strategies for individuals seeking to leave the criminal underworld. It became Elena's primary focus, creating escape pathways for individuals who, like her, had been conditioned into hopelessness where violence was the only tool. Concurrently, Raphael expanded their legitimate business interests, forging alliances and creating employment for former associates. He excelled. The same cognitive acuity and behavioral insight that dominated the underworld proved highly effective in the corporate sphere. They created something tangible, an inheritance for Sophia, and evidence of a powerful drive for self-reinvention. For their 10th anniversary, they entered Chicago Memorial not as fugitives, but as the institution's most significant benefactors. Their donation funded an entirely new wing for high-risk obstetrics, equipped with technology to safeguard infants like Sophia, who began life in a precarious state. Dr. Webb, showing signs of age, but with his perception unchanged, was present. He clasped Raphael's hand. I recall the night you presented at my ER, he communicated. Your demeanor suggested you would destroy the city if we failed to save her. A correct assessment, Raphael confirmed, his tone factual. But your intervention was successful. They were mutually beneficial agents of survival. I merely observed from the periphery. Webb's focus shifted to Elena and Sophia, the child positioned between them. You have constructed something remarkable. This facility will prevent many fatalities. That is our sole objective, Elena stated quietly. We cannot reverse the harm, but we can attempt to generate a net positive outcome. It is the only form of penance available. Webb smiled faintly. My congratulations. Later, while ambulating through the sterile corridors, with Sophia's hand linking theirs, Elena visualized the subject who had collapsed there 10 years prior, hemorrhaging, traumatized, convinced her narrative had concluded. That former self could not have conceived of this current iteration, nor that survival was merely a preliminary stage, that new life could emerge from a destroyed landscape, or that antisocial acts could culminate in this calm outcome. Yet it was fact. Redemption, Elena now understood, was not the clearing of a debt. It was the bearing of one's history, internalizing its data, and constructing a new reality upon the remnants of the old. Elena's legacy presented a paradox. She was a ruthless defender of her kin and a facilitator of second chances for others in the life she had abandoned. This was her reality. Mother? Sophia's query interrupted her internal monologue. Are you exhibiting a lacrimal response? Elena was unaware of the tears, a physiological reaction to the memory of their near-total system failure. Sophia's diagnosis was not luck, but will. You ensured our success. There, in the building's lobby, the nexus where uttering Raphael's name initiated the entire sequence, their presence was evidence of a shared victory. Their quiet existence was a statement of survival. From a crucible of violence and fortune, of destruction and renewal, They had forged a new purpose. They had constructed a dominion on aggression, only to systematically deconstruct it for the sake of a positive future outcome. Theirs was a familial unit bound not by social contract, but by a potent daily decision for mutual affiliation. Later, within their residence, now a sanctuary, not a fortified position, Elena observed Sophia sleeping. A decade before, she had made a commitment. The cycle of trauma she inherited would end with her, leaving her daughter's environment uncontaminated. That commitment was fulfilled, not through moral purity, but through brutal effectiveness. Here is the core of the analysis. That maternal protective instinct, when weaponized, can become a force capable of destabilizing established power structures. Elena Moretti's transformation was total. She entered the precipitating event, a victim, and emerged an apex figure. She became an arbiter of outcomes, developing mastery in the calculated application of cruelty and clemency. She built an empire with the sole objective of its planned demolition, all to engineer a superior environment for her offspring. Elena Moretti does not fit the profile of a virtuous subject. She is an entity of deep ethical ambiguity. But finally, she was integrated. Surveying the Chicago cityscape, she felt a sudden resonance, perceiving a metropolis of countless private conflicts and desperate aspirations that mirrored her own. She then understood that in the chaos of existence, simplistic labels of good and evil are rendered meaningless. Progress often requires navigating through shadow, but the darkness itself is not the required end state. Psychological rebirth remains a possibility, even for subjects who have violated every social norm. She found Raphael, the partner who perceived her not despite her darker traits, but because of them. He had identified her predatory psychology not as a defect to be suppressed, but as a capacity to be directed. Their partnership was an alchemy of anabolic and catabolic forces. This is their ongoing function, to deconstruct and rebuild for the subsequent generation. Because attachment in their paradigm provides no absolution for past transgressions, it functions, instead, as the motivation to pursue behavioral improvement and to construct a new legacy from the ruin. And that, this case file suggests, is its own form of grace.